Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Unknown. Tonight we ask the question whispered through cathedrals and sealed archives. What if Jesus left a bloodline, one so dangerous that kings, popes, and entire orders of knights worked to bury it? The following words were spoken by Father Luigi Gianni himself. Some truths are not lost, they are withheld to protect what should never be questioned. He was explaining why certain archives remain sealed, but his phrase echoes something deeper. For over a millennium, the Church has faced a theological nightmare. What if Jesus had descendants? What if spiritual authority came through bloodline rather than apostolic succession? The implications would shatter the foundations of papal power, royal legitimacy, and everything built on the idea that Christ left no earthly heirs. Digital tools now make hiding such secrets nearly impossible, which is why the stakes have never been higher. But first, before we begin, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button goes a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now let us begin by picturing the Gospels open before you, their thin parchment catching the shift of candlelight. At first glance you find names, places, and the familiar rhythm of parable and miracle. Yet as you let your finger travel across the columns, you begin to sense what is not there. The silence around Jesus' family feels almost like a shadow painted into the text, a territory deliberately uncharted. His mother, yes, appears often, attending key moments from birth to final hour. His brothers and sisters turn up more briefly, mentioned as though they are incidental, almost footnotes in a greater narrative. But then the trail goes cold. No wife, no children, no hint of a lineage that might carry his story into flesh and time beyond his crucifixion. That silence endures, stretching across centuries. For many believers, that absence has always been taken as certainty, proof that the figure of Christ stood outside ordinary family bonds, free from the lines of inheritance that shape the rest of human history. Yet the silence can be examined in another light. Some whisper that such a void is too carefully kept, that the early custodians of the faith chose which threads to weave into canon while leaving others in darkness. In that space of absence, later writers would pour their allegories, their poems of mystery, and their veiled suggestions of what had been deliberately set aside. The stillness becomes as important as the words themselves. Sometimes what is missing tells the louder story. Beyond the canon lies a cluster of writings that never found their way into official scripture. In caves and buried jars of Egypt, in codices tucked away by those called heretics, fragments breathe hints of another memory. Among them, the Gospel of Philip calls Mary Magdalene not merely a follower but a companion. Supporters suggest this choice of word could mean more than spiritual closeness, more than trusted disciple. For some, it evokes partnership, even marriage. For others, the word carries weight of intimacy, suggesting Magdalene as not only a trusted witness, but perhaps the keeper of something new. An earthly continuation, a living future bound to Christ in body as well as spirit. The fragments never unroll into clear statements. They are whispers, half-erased lines that had to survive beneath centuries of suspicion. But those faint voices shaped speculation, powerful enough to travel through art, myth, and legend. Medieval poets and chroniclers took up the story not with blunt assertion but with coded image. The Grail romances, long sung in courts of Europe, speak of a mysterious vessel to be sought with courage and faith. Yet even here, within the allegories of knights' quests and sacred tests, a single word sneaks in like a chisel line in stone: Sangreal. For generations read as Holy Grail, yet when the syllables are broken differently, the pattern sharpens into something new: Sangreal, royal blood. Two readings cohabit the same letters, like an image shifting when the light strikes differently. If the second reading holds, then the Grail is not a cup at all. It is a bloodline, a lineage buried beneath layers of chivalric challenge and allegorical tale. Supporters suggest the shift in meaning was no accident. Storytellers, they claim, often encoded truths in ways only certain listeners could decipher. A chalice was safe. It could be displayed, embraced, revered without consequence. But a bloodline, if whispered of too directly, would unsettle everything. Doctrines of virginity, succession, and the Church's claim to appoint authority without competition. To imagine the Grail as a family is to imagine the Christian story not as something closed, but as something that might still breathe, through descendants scattered and hidden. Critics counter that this is linguistic play, a convenient rearrangement with little basis in intent. Yet once you hear the alternate reading, the possibility seems to lodge in the mind. The quest itself then bends. Knights riding eastward in search of relics may instead appear as figures charged with protecting a genealogical thread. The cup becomes a metaphor for womb. The vessel becomes lineage. Stories of quests and guardians straining to preserve a sacred treasure might unfold as allegories. They hint at a line of descent that could not be shown openly. Think of the scribes and minstrels who carried these tales across Europe. Was their audience perhaps primed to hear the second meaning? Or was the double entendre preserved as a safety net, a story that could be sung at court without inviting censure, yet still carry a deeper resonance for those with ears tuned to hidden notes? Imagine holding a manuscript where ink has worn thin with age. The letters blur, flake, or have been scraped for fresh writing, leaving traces of what came before. The canonical Gospels are like that, sturdy sentences above, but beneath them whole stories erased. In Egypt's sands, in the whispers of Gnostic sects, fragments of these erased ideas survive. They offer Magdalene not simply as penitent sinner, as the later church cast her, but as the figure closest to Christ, the first witness, the companion. In art centuries later, her image often takes on traits different from traditional saints: red hair, mournful eyes, a presence that does not fit the pattern of penance but instead suggests transmission, inheritance. Some painters presented her with vessels of oil, jars of ointment, symbols of anointing and healing, but also of carrying. Place these strands together, and a quiet but dangerous suggestion forms. Perhaps the true treasure of Christendom was never meant to be a chalice crafted by hands, but a family tree carried through generations. The stillness of the official Gospels then changes character, not oversight, but curation. A silence shaped like a choice. Those who arranged the canon may have carved down the story until no earthly continuation could be discerned. To preserve divinity through doctrine, the bloodline had to be displaced into metaphor. Yet the coded messages and alternate texts linger, like faint outlines beneath overpainting that never quite disappears. Think of the implications. If Christ left descendants, then authority shifted radically. Holy power would no longer flow only through offices appointed by bishops and popes, but through veins and names, through living heirs. A church built on an unbroken chain of hands, each bishop consecrating the next, would face rival legitimacy rooted not in ritual, but in biology. A king might claim closer kinship to Christ than the pope who crowned him. A village family in some valley far from Rome might carry blood that displaces every throne and altar. Even the smallest suggestion of such a possibility explains why silence was safeguarded so fiercely. Medieval romances then take on sharper edges. The Grail Knights may wander the land not as seekers of relics, but as protectors of bloodline, guardians sworn to keep hidden heirs safe until the appointed time. The trials, the codes of secrecy, the ordeals of worthiness, all may echo protocols of lineage preservation, disguised in a form of entertainment that passed royal courts without causing alarm. While the wider audience heard tales of brave knights chasing chalices in foreign lands, those attuned to the double reading might have understood it differently. The heirs of Christ survive. They must be shielded. The Grail is not out there in some far shrine, The Grail walks in flesh, and so the silence in the canon takes on the character of intentional redaction rather than oversight. We cannot prove it. Critics dismiss the idea as romantic fancy, projecting later medieval tropes backwards onto early Christianity. But the story persists. It endures not because evidence is overwhelming, but because the absence itself feels crafted, as if shaped by hands who knew more than they chose to record. Centuries later, in half-lit cathedrals and whispered romances, the thread stirs again, forming lines that point to one woman who lingers at the edge of every possibility. Mary Magdalene, disciple in one tradition, the apostle to the apostles in another. If the silence veils a family, she would stand at its beginning, the vessel through whom the hidden line continued. In painted frescoes, she's often given gestures of embrace or bearing, not simply mourning. In popular memory of Provence and Languedoc, her legend carries her across the sea into the soil of Gaul, establishing roots. There, a future dynasty would later rise, claiming whispers of sacred inheritance. Her story becomes the hinge, halfway between suppression and preservation, a presence that refuses to vanish. This is where the silence turns, from blank space in gospel columns to coded echoes in romance poems, from erased fragments to songs of knights on impossible quests. The Grail breaks apart into two readings, two possible truths. On one side, a cup of gold, on the other, a bloodline, and at the centre of both stands a single woman, caught between erasure and exaltation, perhaps the living vessel of what remains unsaid. It is here that our path shifts from manuscripts to landscapes, from words on fragile pages to caves, crypts, and shrines. The quiet of the Gospels and the splitting of Sangreal into Sangreal lead us toward the figure walking just beyond the margins of the canon. Mary Magdalene, not merely as disciple, but as vessel, companion, and possible matriarch of a line hidden beneath centuries of silence. Her footsteps carry us toward the next horizon, into the hills and caverns where legend and lineage intertwine, waiting to be sought anew. The path that leads up into La Sainte-Baume is hushed by pine forests and cool shadow. Travellers report that the air shifts there, damp from seepage in the limestone caves. Along the walls, older than most of the shrines of France, painted forms remain. A woman in flowing robes, hair rendered red with minerals that never entirely fade. The church had not yet sanctioned her cult when these images were painted. Still, she looks out with large, expectant eyes. Some recognise her instantly as Mary Magdalene, long before Rome gave official permission. Her presence in fresco is less penitential than maternal, as if the painter knew her as source, not sinner. This raises a question that lingers in those caverns like cool mist. Why would local artisans honour her in that way? Some whisper the tradition came directly with her arrival. Stories in Provence tell of Mary crossing the sea after Christ's death, bringing nothing but a small band of companions and a message too delicate for open proclamation. Within those stories, visitors said she taught from the cave, lived her final years in isolation, and left a mark so indelible that peasants centuries later still brought flowers there. To frame her in red hair again and again gave her a visual anchor, a trait that felt hereditary, not symbolic. It was not only art, it resembled a record. Outside the cave, an entire band of legends built around this figure persisted. In Provençal villages, oral accounts spoke not of penance but of continuity. In neighbouring Occitan regions, songs remembered her differently from sermons heard in cathedrals. A phrase arose, "the woman who knew Christ's touch." It was careful. It allowed listeners to hear what they wished. Did it mean a disciple most trusted with teaching? Or did it mean something relational, even conjugal? The line was deliberately thin. Folklore often keeps truths slippery, leaving space for reverence without confrontation. Those who heard the tales in candlelit kitchens might have taken the words more literally than those who repeated them from pulpits. artists responded to these stories with persistence. Across southern France, images of Magdalene wearing hair rendered as long and burnished proliferated. Curiously, many were grouped within the same valleys that also nurtured Cathar memory centuries later. Frescoes, carvings, devotional icons, each introduced her not simply as a repentant penitent, but as bearer. The repetition drew attention. Supporters say it marked a deliberate act of preservation, visually encoding her role as potential mother to a lineage. Critics counter that red hair was a simple medieval convention signifying passion or independence rather than genetics. Even if symbolic, the sheer recurrence created a pattern that is hard to ignore. Sometimes symbols carry truths that words cannot. Literary traditions of the era wrapped around this symbolism. Grail romances, so concerned with sacred vessels, often described them with language more befitting a womb than a chalice. Poets described mysteries of blood contained within form, guarded across generations. To read these lines as simple metaphors for chalices turns the poetry into pure piety. Read them as veiled messages about genealogy, however, and the Grail quest shifts tone entirely. The knight ceases to be a treasure seeker. He becomes the guardian of inheritance. This becomes sharper when placed against the geographic spread of Magdalene traditions. Her shrines concentrate exactly where the romances were composed, as though story and space reinforced one another. At the same time, alternative Christian communities, most notably the Cathars of Languedoc, placed unusual emphasis on the sacred feminine. Where Orthodox Christianity restricted leadership to apostolic succession, the Cathars spoke of dual principles, feminine as equal in relevance to masculine. Their teachings drew heavily on forbidden writings, the very ones that hinted at Magdalene's prominence. In these sects, spiritual power could flow through inherited knowledge and body alike. Here bloodline mattered as much as sacrament. No surprise, perhaps, that the Church regarded them not only as heretical, but dangerous. To permit the spread of memory connecting Christ to an earthly bloodline would threaten too many pillars at once. Some suspect that is why the suppression of Cathars in the Albigensian Crusade was waged with such ferocity. It was not mere theological disagreement, but a silencing of genealogical rumour. The geography itself seems complicit. If you trace the map of shrines, from La Sainte-Baume to Saint-Maximin, you notice how they cluster in the same regions that medieval families later tied to Merovingian descent. Pilgrimage sites are not scattered randomly. They form corridors across valleys and river routes that were once lifelines of early dynasties. Someone following the trail would recognise it as more than devotional. It looks like memory marked into landscape. Mountains serve as reminders, chapels as stone ledgers. Those who visited may have believed they were seeking sanctity. Perhaps unconsciously, they were also treading an ancestral trail. Imagine local peasants in medieval Provence climbing the slope on feast days. They carried baskets of fruit, jars of oil, scraps of hair to leave at the shrine. Did they know they were participating in a memory older than papal decree? Their actions might have seemed rustic, but folklore often conceals sophisticated memory-keeping. The story of Magdalene in Gaul ran beneath sermons imposed from above. Oral tradition sustained it when paper would have been confiscated. To villagers, she was not an abstract symbol. She was a woman who once physically walked their soil. That sense of proximity fueled her continued presence, beyond canon and decree, shaping her into a vessel that signified far more than repentance. Supporters of the bloodline idea see these shrines as signals, stone beacons pointing back to the possibility of descent. Critics suggest they are ordinary regional devotions amplified into myth by modern imaginations. Yet the fact remains, they gathered followers centuries before Rome approved. That alone suggests something beneath surface devotion. These traditions could preserve a memory of continuity disguised as faith. Centuries of repetition gave the stories durability. When the Merovingians claimed descent, they already had a regional framework that made such an idea plausible. Public memory had been primed to accept Magdalene as mother and bearer. Consider the odd consistency of her portrayal. Across frescoes, stained glass and sculpture, her face takes on the same angular traits. Not the generic saintly anonymity used for many female figures, but features that look inherited, repeated by different artists. Was it archetype, or was it a stylized family resemblance being smuggled through art? In a world where open genealogy was dangerous to proclaim, visual shorthand might have been the only safe path. Painters could depict Magdalene's supposed descendants without writing names. They simply painted the same features, the same hair, the same vessel in her hand, an archive coded into pigment. The Cathar lands reinforced this reading by hosting the Grail romances themselves. Troubadours sang of quests where feminine wisdom guided the knight. The vessel was sought through female intermediaries, queens and maidens keeping guardianship. To interpret these purely as allegories of virtue may erase a second meaning humming faint beneath the text. Teachers often passed dangerous truths through layers of allegory. By the time clerics censored the songs, the traditions had already seeded themselves in memory across entire provinces. Once again, suppression arrived too late to uproot. Walking the Magdalene sites today, you feel the weight of palimpsest. A grand church at Saint-Maximin rises over what is claimed to be her crypt. A cave shrine at La Sainte-Baume remains adorned with centuries of votive gifts. Even modern pilgrims often remark that the atmosphere feels older than Catholic sanction, as though the cave tells its own story regardless of doctrine. Geography becomes custodian of memory. Stone outlasts script. It offers testimony stubborn against redaction. These places form a kind of archive independent of official record, one that does not yield easily to erasure. Some whisper that when folk repeated these stories, they were less concerned with theology than with genealogy. To remember Magdalene was to remember possibility, that Christianity did not end as a closed line at Golgotha, but continued in flesh and family. If so, the frescoes and shrines act as genealogical beacons, disguised as reverence but pointing beyond. When later dynasties reached back to her, they connected to a network of memory already familiar on the ground, which makes the possibility of bloodline not just fanciful speculation, but an interpretation rooted in centuries of continuity. From cave to crypt, from song to shrine, the Magdalene motif carried whispers of preservation. The vessel is not simply sacred cup, but living womb, bearer of continuity. If such was the case, then her presence in Provence set the stage for dynastic politics centuries later. The Merovingians, with their emphasis on sacred inheritance, easily tied themselves to her story. Claiming Magdalena as ancestress transformed political lineage into sacred descent, and in doing so, it threatened every institution that relied on controlling narrative rather than blood. This is the thread we follow now. From the caves where peasants left offerings to the courtyards where kings were crowned, it does not disappear. The stories of Magdalene walking into Provence bleed seamlessly into Merovingian claims of divine hair and sacred authority. Whether truth or protective myth, the idea of lineage survived ready for adoption by dynastic ambition. The path takes us next into the annals of kingship. The moment a Merovingian ruler falls by spear, leaving a bloodline said to have gone underground. Secrets carved into caves flow into secrets buried beneath tombstones and erased from chronicles, and with them, the shape of the Grail itself continues to change. The forest near Stine would have been brittle with frost on a December morning. You can almost hear the crunch of leaves under the hooves of horses, the breath of riders rising like pale smoke as they steer their way through hollow light. Dagobert II, the returning king, travelled that way in the year 679, carrying the weight of exile come full circle. His rule had been reinstated, but only thinly. Shadows of opposition trailed him closely. And it was on that path, just before Christmas, that a spear pierced his eye and ended not only his reign, but perhaps the last visible claim of a dynasty wrapped in whispers of sacred descent. The blow was not random. The choice of date, the setting, and even the weapon feels staged, meant for those who would catch the sign. This is what we know. Dagobert had been driven from his throne as a child, forced into exile where memory of his line could have easily faded into obscurity. Yet against expectation he returned, reclaiming his position from the factions that had dismissed him. That restoration, brief as it was, threatened structures of power already anxious about Merovingian independence. He was not a puppet king, not easily bent to the authority of the church or to the rising Carolingians waiting in the wings. His very body carried a claim, the long unshorn hair of a Merovingian. A right to rule grown through blood, not handed down in oil. That alone placed him at odds with a church eager to frame royal legitimacy as something handed down through holy oil, not grown through blood. When the spear struck, chronicles named it a killing but said little more, yet the details wander beyond ordinary ambition. Recorded accounts are selective, some curiously brief. His death is often layered in cryptic phrasing, as if writers prefer to step carefully around the implications. The fact that he died in the woods near Stine, rather than on a battlefield of open rebellion, gave it the feel of ambush, planned, quiet, almost ritualistic. Later traditions noticed the weapon chosen, a spear through the eye. For ordinary assassins, a dagger in the back would suffice. For symbol builders, however, this pointed straight to myth. Some suggest it echoed not only the spear of Longinus that pierced Christ's side, but also older pagan symbols of sacrifice. Tying Dagobert's fall to narratives meant to seal meaning into memory. His heir, Sigisbert IV, should have inherited power. Royal sons of the Merovingians always carried weight, even if disputed. But here the record becomes strangely thin. Chronicles that catalogue less significant nobles fall strangely mute when it comes to him. He disappears into erasure rather than death, alive in name but not in written continuation. Some whisper that this was no oversight. It was a crafted gap, a silencing to mask survival. Removing his name from official memory allowed whatever became of him to unfold outside surveillance. If he lived, his line could continue without claimants sparking unrest. If he was extinguished quietly, omission served the same end. Hierarchy without rival. Either way, the blacked out line says more than denial ever could. From there the pattern sharpens. After his murder, the legitimacy of the Merovingians frayed step by step. Their sacred authority, once tied to the uncut hair and the miraculous vial of oil at Rheims, slowly transferred into Carolingian hands. Chronicles are rewritten to frame the Merovingians less as anointed kings, and more as decadent relics of a past order. The priest historians guiding that memory cast new light. The older dynasty became symbols of misrule, the new one embodiments of progress under church approval. Yet you can still sense the discomfort in how Dagobert's end was set down. Some scribes rendered the account in tones more mournful than accusatory, as though forced to suppress words they could not print aloud. Later theorists took hold of these gaps with both hands. If bloodline mattered more than institution, then Sigisbert's disappearance was not loss, it was concealment. His absence could be read as proof of survival, like a lamp dimmed but not extinguished. If that were true, the bloodline would not disappear but go underground, carried through secret marriages, hidden refuges, whispered transmissions. His assassination becomes not a termination, but the most efficient cover story. The crown fell, the record was redacted, yet the family thread slipped below notice when no papal decree could reach it. If true, every monarch afterward carried vulnerability, always the chance that a hidden heir with closer claim to sacred descent might one day rise. That risk, perhaps, is why the mode of the assassination matters. A thrust through the eye reads less like political violence and more like statement. Here it sows resonance. As Christ's line was ended by spear, so Dagobert's line seemed ended by spear. The gesture could be read as sending a message. Your inheritance ends here. Yet symbols work both ways. To those who suspected survival, the weapon whispered a parallel instead. Just as death on the cross did not erase memory, death of Dagobert did not empty lineage. It turned the bloodline into martyrdom, reinforcing its sacred character. When reading chronicles of this era, you quickly notice how much was designed with performance in mind. The church framed legitimacy carefully. Kings acceptable to them received detailed record, liturgical blessing, miracle attributions. Kings at odds with them are treated with brevity, moral decline, or categorical silence. Dagobert's assassination sits uncomfortably in between. He is martyred by violence but dismissed by history at the same time. That duality is exactly the opening where theories thrive. It makes the official story too neat, too eager to flatten a rupture that surely would have unsettled those who heard of it in the villages and courts of Gaul. Imagine villagers hearing news carried by travellers, their king slain in the forest, struck through the face. They might whisper among themselves in market squares. Did the killers work alone, or did bishops close to the throne bless it under cloak of secrecy? The villagers had seen how the king's hair became symbol of authority. They would understand why clerics who cut hair considered it equal to dethroning. In their minds, his death may have rung deeper than a simple feud. It marked an end of an age when kingship and sacred inheritance seemed bound together in the same body. For some, Sigisbert's absence was concealment. A line dimmed and moved south through marriages. Others call it myth spun from gaps. The truth sits in the emptiness, and stories rush to fill it. What remains striking is how swiftly power shifted after his fall. Within decades, the Carolingians rose to prominence, first as mayors of the palace, then as kings themselves. The church sanctioned their ascent, sealing their legitimacy in ritual that rewrote succession rules. Sacred power no longer flowed through inherited descent. It now flowed through papal blessing and coronation. Dagobert's ending, therefore, marks the hinge moment. Dynastic rule founded on blood cut-off, institutional rule sealed in oil ascendant. It was not only a murder, but also a transfer of metaphysical authority. The resonance of this shift rippled long after. Storytellers remembered Dagobert shadowed by tragedy. Local cults venerated him in regions like Stine, whispering of miracles near his grave. To venerate him publicly was to challenge official narratives, so devotion remained quiet, hidden in side chapels or local feasts not recognised broadly. Yet that undercurrent endured enough so that centuries later his name erupted again in bloodline legends. What seemed extinguished in one era became inspiration in another, so the assassination carries two possible readings. On the surface, a political killing to stabilise realms and smooth the church's path to dominate kingship. Beneath that surface, perhaps, a calculated moment to drive a bloodline into secrecy, keeping it alive only through shadow networks. Either way, the spear's thrust ended more than a life. It closed one style of kingship, the hair-grown sovereignty of the Merovingians, and ushered in the church-structured monarchy of the Carolingians. That double resonance explains why the story refused to vanish, why whispers of Sigisbert's survival would return with renewed force centuries later when legends of sacred lines blossomed again. Yet there is more to this quiet. The rupture is not only genealogical but archaeological. Dagobert's body, like the memory of his child, is caught in ambiguity. His supposed tomb is debated, his remains contested, hints of concealment shrouded in later chronicles, which turns us toward the ground itself, graves, crypts, necropolises that should have anchored certainty. Instead, they offer contradiction, hinting at concealment within burial records. If the story of bloodline concealment continued, it would not be limited to human silence. Even stone would withhold, as if the very tombs of France had learned to keep secrets. In the halls of their audience chambers, the Merovingian kings seemed less like rulers of earthly kingdoms and more like living relics in their own right. Their hair, uncut from birth, grew long over their shoulders, strands often braided or ornamented with small clasps of metal or bone. People spoke of it in tones of reverence, as if each lock carried the shimmer of divine origin. These kings did not wear crowns in the way later dynasties did, for their inheritance was said to flow directly through their bodies. The scalp itself was thought to channel heavenly sanction, and the hair became both mark and mantle, a form of visible anointment. There was lore behind this belief. The cutting of a Merovingian king's hair was not simply an act of humiliation, but the removal of legitimacy itself. To shear a ruler was to make him unfit for the throne, severed at once from power both political and sacred. In chronicles we hear of rival nobles forcing captured heirs to the barber's knife, reducing princes to ordinary men in a single act. A clipped Merovingian might still breathe, but he was already dethroned. It was execution without blood, proof of how spirit and body intertwined in this dynasty's rule. The belief was not isolated to Gaul. Across cultures, hair often bore the weight of sacred duty. Samson in Hebrew tradition, the top knots of the Norse, the oracle braids of desert prophets. To the Merovingians, these echoes provided reinforcement, a sense that their form of kingship aligned with a deeper pattern, linking blood and divinity. Supporters say these echoes prove the Merovingians were heirs to a sacral current, not just post-Roman warlords. Critics call it coincidence. Either way, they lived as if long hair marked them as chosen. Beneath ritual, there was oil. The story tells of Clovis, the first Merovingian king to ascend with overt Christian legitimacy. In 496 he was baptized at Rheims, and as the chronicles record, a vial of chrism descended by miracle, carried by a dove. Supporters claim this anointing with heavenly oil set apart his rule forever, making it different from tribal kingship won by sword or vote. The vial itself, known as the Saint-Ampoule, was said to endure down the centuries, reused at coronations of later kings. Oil from beyond earth, placed upon flesh, confirmed divine favour in a way papal sanction alone could not. For the Merovingians, this created a sacred fusion of flesh and substance, hair marking lineage, oil marking transcendence. Clovis's baptism became replayed in memory as cornerstone narrative. The act at Rheims established a pattern repeated for centuries. Kings were not simply installed, they were consecrated, transformed into embodiments of sacred history through direct contact with relic-charged oil. Some whisper that this oil did more than sanctify. It may have symbolically grafted the king into the story of Christ's own anointing. In doing so, it offered legitimacy not from empire or from Rome, but from heaven directly. This was dangerous ground. It implied that a Merovingian king wielded divine recognition without papal intermediaries. For an ascendant church in need of central control, such claims risked fragmenting the very notion of universal authority. Their tombs, when later opened or written about, reinforced the sense of sacral identity. Childeric, one of their monarchs, was buried with golden bees. Tiny figures hammered from precious metal, numbering in the hundreds, swarmed his grave as tokens of immortality and resurrection. Bees, unlike lions or eagles, spoke of renewal, of community, of perpetual order. They clustered into heraldry that reached far forward in European symbolism, until centuries later Napoleon would revive the bee motif as if guided back to some forgotten legitimacy. Alongside bees were found flecks of fleur-de-lis patterns, stylized lilies that became emblems of purity and continuity in French regal imagery. These artifacts anchor the Merovingian claim to be more than temporal rulers. Their graves suggested a theology written in gold, in stone, in soil itself. Chroniclers carried the tales further, speaking of dreams foretelling future battles, healings performed by touch, and independence from Rome that raised suspicion. Merovingian kings often defied bishops with audacity, preferring their own rituals and laws over imported orthodoxy. Their genealogy made them proud, their rituals stubbornly unique. To subjects, this independence only heightened the aura of sacral kingship, but to the bishops and popes who pressed for uniform doctrine, it rendered them dangerous. Here was a line of rulers whose legitimacy claimed heaven's sanction through body, hair and oil, not through papal declaration. When rivals finally rose, the Carolingians who would cut their hair and present them as inadequate, the method of displacement revealed the risk posed by this theology. By clipping locks and rewriting chronicles, rivals cut more than hair. They severed memory itself. They reshaped lineage as myth instead of bloodline, applauding the Church's sanction as true source of legitimacy. Yet whispers remained, suggesting what had been abandoned in official narrative still throbbed beneath the surface. Legends do not vanish when cut. They coil and wait. Globally, echoes support the resonance of such practices. In Mesopotamia, oils linked kings to gods. In Egypt, hair itself was thought to channel divine order. Among the Maya, crowns bore bees beside jaguars, tying rebirth to rule. Across these spans we see the same rhythm: body, oil, hair and symbol, creating kingship that blurred politics with divinity. The Merovingians, whether borrowing or partaking of universal heritage, stood inside this wide chorus of sacred rule. Supporters of the bloodline story build upon this. They argue that if the Merovingians truly descended from Magdalen's line, then these traditions were not simple pagan survivals repurposed, but the continuation of a theology of flesh. The hair, allowed to grow uncut, made visible the unbroken blood that tied them back to Christ. The oil, descended in miracle, confirmed that heaven recognized this line physically rather than institutionally. Critics dismiss this as late invention layered on earlier practices, but the fact stands that their kingship was embodied and visibly traceable in unique ways. Imagine a coronation at Reims centuries after Clovis. The oils touched to forehead, lips, shoulder and hand. The crowd no doubt smelled the chrism's heavy fragrance thick with herbs. The candidate's hair, long and gleaming, was shaped but never cut. For the gathered assembly, this was not political theatre, it was transformation. They watched a man turned vessel, a king reborn with qualities impossible to strip away short of searing humiliation. The crown that followed was almost redundant. The true crown was hair itself, sanctified by oil. To the faithful, the authority was unquestionable, for it was inscribed into the body by ritual that pointed above and beyond earthly approval. In this, the Merovingians presented a theological nightmare to later Rome. Their throne did not need papal blessing, not in its core essence. Even stripped of ceremony, their bodies kept the markers. The tension was inevitable. Either this dynasty continued, and Christ's supposed bloodline remained a threat to hierarchical order, or it was obscured, displaced, and rewritten. History shows the latter, yet the signs they embodied still speak, even now. Bees unearthed from burial shine with the same glint. Hair and oil appear again in later coronations, in different hands, reused to reinforce claims by rulers less anchored in flesh and more in church approval. Sacred kingship in this form became intolerable because it suggested a vision of holiness outside ecclesiastical control. Hair and oil could not be manipulated or voted upon by councils. They passed through generations, accumulating sanctity as legacy rather than office. Some whisper this was the very reason the Merovingian dynasty needed to be replaced. That narrative control required shifting legitimacy from body to institution. If so, the story of their long hair and heavenly anointing becomes more than court ritual. It becomes testimony to an alternate mode of authority, one that might still unsettle our understanding of kingship, church, and power itself. The pattern reveals itself most sharply when tombs are opened, where artifacts and remains should tell all. Yet here, the narrative falters. Graves that once promised certainty instead trail into ambiguity. Missing, altered, or inconsistent. Where golden bees assure continuity, silence and gaps suggest erasure. If their bodies bore sacred marks in life, does their absence in death speak with equal intensity? To answer requires moving from court to crypt, down into the chambers where stone lids have been shifted, names erased, and memory wrapped again in concealment. Their stones carry grooves, patterns and colours that refuse to fade, as if memory, once driven underground, rose again in the walls of France's great churches. Walk into Chartres at dusk and the shift is immediate. The language of absence becomes a language of symbols. Chartres breathes differently at twilight. As shadows lengthen, certain carvings seem to wake. A faint outline in the stonework, a curve no tour guide mentions, steps forward when the sun has slipped behind the horizon. The air cools, carrying faint echoes from the labyrinth embedded in the floor. Visitors walk in slow spirals across its 11 circuits, not knowing each ring is said to echo an older design traced in places once touched by Crusader knights. The sequence is precise, carried like a code between hands that carved very different buildings. To most, it is only meditation. To others, the floor twists into something closer to a map. Stone speaks differently from parchment. Medieval stonemasons left deliberate signatures, small geometric cuts that marked both their presence and their guild. At Chartres, Amiens, Reims, Santiago, the same hand marks appear, though separated by distance and years. They are not identical but cousins, triangles echoing stars, curves bending toward vessel-like shapes. Critics dismiss this as guild tradition repeated, a kind of professional shorthand. Supporters suggest something more, that the masons, moving from project to project, carried with them symbols not in writing but in stone, forming a silent network across Europe that chronicled things unfit for public record. Think of the labyrinth again, 11 circuits, turning inward and outward like a breath drawn and held. Some whisper it is not only meditation but memory, an outline akin to a reduced plan of Solomon's Temple. Pilgrims who walked its course might have been reenacting something deeper than a penitential journey. They may have been tracing sacred stations that mapped genealogical lineage rather than theology alone. The winding could represent generations, each ring turning inward toward a hidden core, an heir protected at its centre. Others dismiss this as speculative geometry, placed atop design meant only for contemplation. Yet the consistent recurrence of labyrinths at sites tied to Templars and Merovingian patrons tilts the pattern toward intention. Walk your hand gently over the columns and capitals and other motifs press forward. A 7-pointed star carved into margins too deliberate to be accident. In the medieval mind, the number 7 conjured perfection, the days of creation, the spheres of heaven. The star could be theological, or it could nod to flesh as divine instrument, earth and heaven woven together. Critics counter that every number of points finds its way into Gothic design. Yet the consistency, the same number scratched into stones far apart, suggests echo louder than coincidence. Trees are another recurring image, stylized, branching with a symmetry that makes them resemble family charts rendered in stone. Roots widen, limbs rise, knots carry shapes like intertwined initials. They might be read as the tree of life, yet their proportion carries uncanny similarity to medieval genealogical scrolls. One can picture a mason, warned not to write forbidden lineages, chiselling an image unassuming enough to pass authority but exact enough to carry a message to future viewers. The tree remains where ink could be erased. Feminine figures also appear, robed and calm, holding vessels before the viewer. In Reims, in Santiago, even hidden in dim transepts of Paris, they stand. The vessel sometimes resembles a chalice, sometimes a jar, sometimes soft enough in shape to remind of the womb or cradle. To orthodox interpretation, these are depictions of Mary as bearer of grace. Yet in regions dense with Magdalene veneration, the figure becomes heavier with possibility. Magdalene herself, the vessel, the one who carries a living continuation rather than symbolic balm. If such was the intent, artists cloaked it in piety, ensuring the figure would survive iconoclasms, passing as accepted devotion while carrying other resonances. Among the most tangible echoes are the Black Madonnas. Their faces darken not by time but deliberately rendered that way from creation. They cluster in specific valleys steeped in Magdalene tradition. The statues make no sense under official iconography. Depictions of Mary were usually pale and ethereal in medieval Europe, yet here she holds a child or vessel with calm gravity, features shadowed, body rooted. Supporters say this darkness signifies hidden bloodline, preserved beneath the visible, a memory encoded in holy figures that could not be publicly challenged. Critics argue soot from candles or stylistic preference explains the difference. Yet where they appear in greatest number, southern France, northern Spain, tradition of Magdalene as living bearer also has oldest roots. Even large cathedrals conceal inscriptions hinting at lines uncomfortable for doctrine. In certain chapels of Notre Dame de Paris, older Latin phrases reference the blood of the carpenter's son. The phrase suits theology, blood shed for salvation, but placed in context with vessels and lineage trees carved nearby, it invites a second glance. Blood read through genealogical lens can shift into descendants. Subtle enough to permit official approval, the wording nonetheless sounds like echo of a story about continuation rather than final sacrifice. Absence again feels less empty than deliberate. Some say master masons built libraries not of books but of shapes. Critics point to guild marks or numerology, yet across centuries the same signs reappear. Resonance too strong to dismiss. Take, for instance, the bee, hidden in fresco or mosaic corners, small, nearly mockingly subtle. This creature, associated with the soul in ancient Egypt, as messenger in Greek cults, and later chosen emblem of Merovingian rulers, reappears in unlikely places in Gothic art. Not dominant enough to function decoration, yet too exact to be accident. Did Masons keep alive an older symbolism of divine monarchy through a winged insect symbol? Some accounts whisper Napoleon, centuries later, seized upon bees precisely because they carried this depth of memory. For him, it was a claim that he connected not with Rome but with the oldest French bloodline of all. Whether true or opportunistic, the resonance shows the bee was never forgotten. The fleur-de-lis, so omnipresent on French banners and shields, also enters this lexicon. Popularly read as stylized iris or lily, it did carry sacred undertones of purity. Others argue its form embodies trinity of father, mother, child, the very structure of lineage. Its curves echo both feminine and noble form. Read this way, the emblem ceases to be only royal flower. It becomes genealogical assertion, disguised as symbol of monarchy, rooted in blood as much as nation. That such a widely recognised emblem could cloak alternate narrative again reveals how adept medieval semiotics could be when pressed into secrecy. When viewed collectively, European Gothic cathedrals present less like singular monuments and more like linked manuscripts, carrying consistent metaphors across space. They speak of continuity in ways that liturgy never could. Instead of words prone to censorship, the language is geometry cut into living stone. Walking through them, you trace a lexicon: labyrinth floor, Black Madonna face, vessel in carved hand, seven-pointed star, tree curling on capital, bee at saint's foot, fleur-de-lis in window light. Each becomes a letter in alphabet of memory. Each resists erasure through resilience of architecture. Visitors might never notice. A villager kneeling before Madonna lighting a candle would simply pray with earnest piety. Yet the same statue could signal to a trained eye that bloodline endured beneath smoke of devotion. A knight passing through labyrinth could feel only penance, yet the initiation might encode a story about heirs surviving hidden. Cathedrals thus functioned on two levels: public houses of worship and covert libraries safeguarding lineages that texts dared not record. Supporters maintain that Masons, bound under oaths of secrecy, treated themselves as guardians. They may have considered their architecture both gift to God and archive for those who might someday need record beyond reach of papal power. Critics warn not to overstate. Gothic design already brims with symbolic language tied to theology and cosmology. Overreading can project intent where only craft lay. Both sides admit, however, that symbols spread widely enough to suggest tradition deeper than single parish or guild. At dusk, Chartres captures this duality most starkly. The maze glows faint beneath fading sun. Black Madonna cradles figure in candlelight. Star points sharpen in shadowed dome. Ordinary devotion continues without question. Yet hints survive, not erased even by centuries of official oversight. If we read stone the way archivists read palimpsests, the meaning sharpens. Cathedrals are documents, not just buildings. Their halls archive voices long thought silenced. And yet, for all their symbols, cathedrals only hint. They cannot show flesh. They cannot present bones. If kings carried divinity and life, their graves should proclaim it. But when tombs fall mute, the silence deepens. The nave of Saint-Denis stretches in echoing arches, its stones cool to the touch, and restless with centuries of whispered prayers. Walk along the polished floor and the gaze is pulled again and again toward monuments arranged like chess pieces across the transept. Effigies of kings and queens lie with their hands in prayer, eyelids closed as though still commanding the realm in sleep. Tour guides point easily to tomb after tomb, reciting names of rulers whose timelines remain stable in charted history. Yet, when you come to Dagobert II, that stability cracks. His monument appears in one account, is absent in another, and reappears in later records as though the stone itself could not decide. In a building designed to house eternal testimony, he becomes the ruler whose presence is defined by contradiction. This absence cuts deeper once you examine the care with which other dynasties were honoured. Clovis, who unified the first Frankish kingdom, is memorialised with ceremonial gravity. Charlemagne, though buried elsewhere, is woven constantly into the abbey's remembrance. The Capetians line side chapels with statues that leave no doubt about continuity. Against such meticulous record-keeping, Dagobert II's burial dissolves into silence. Some whisper that his erasure was not the accident of fire or flood, but a decision. In chronicles, his final resting place is described, then later left unnamed, then revised again in uncertain tones. Each correction feels less like misremembering and more like deliberate filtration, as if scribes handled a dangerous relic whose memory required masking. One document raises the tension further, the Chronicon Sionis of 1653. It makes an unusual remark about a vault under Santine, watched by bees. Bees, not guards or priests, but bees. The phrase has puzzled readers for centuries. Critics call it a flourish, an error. But to those who know Merovingian symbols, it recalls Childric's grave, hundreds of golden bees buried beside him. Why then would bees reappear in a cryptic phrase about concealed burials unless it was meant to cipher? Supporters suggest that watched by bees was an encoded way of marking the continuation of a Merovingian line hidden from public notice. The persistence of bee emblems across different times adds pressure to this theory. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, breaking away from Bourbon heraldry, he chose not the fleur-de-lis of traditional kingship but the bee. He had Childric's bees studied, restored, and woven into his imperial regalia. To outside eyes, this looked like an eccentricity, the whim of someone obsessed with antiquity. But Napoleon himself is recorded making curious remarks about a legacy of silence at Saint-Denis, as if he recognised that this symbol carried more than decorative weight. Did he see himself as inheriting something older and more elemental than Bourbon legitimacy? Supporters of the bloodline theory believe Napoleon understood that the bee linked him to rulers whose authority rested on sacred inheritance rather than papal consecration. Archaeological surveys inside Saint-Denis during more modern times only deepen these questions. Many sections of the crypt are catalogued with precision. Which tomb held which sovereign? Which relics were moved during wars? which repairs followed bombings. But alongside this precision are baffling absences. Some inventories identify certain sarcophagi only by number, refusing to attach names. Others note vaults present on structural plans but deliberately sealed, their contents left unexamined without explanation. A worker describing the site once mentioned that in certain passages, doors were bricked in and smoothed over in earlier centuries, creating walls that appear natural unless you look for the slight curve where old mortar shifts tone. The impression is not of careless loss but of intentional suppression, where names are known yet not spoken, and chambers exist yet remain hidden. Critics counter that Dagobert's relative obscurity explains this instability. He ruled briefly after exile and assassination attempts, leaving less monumental presence than descendants who secured dynastic structures. To them, the shifting of his burial record is a symptom of forgotten kingship, not a conspiracy. Yet the same critics must wrestle with the fact that even obscure rulers often possessed fixed tombs once interred at Saint-Denis. Dagobert II alone floats in liminal space, his death recorded, his dynasty erased, his remains concealed or disputed. Against the backdrop of Merovingian whispers about divine descent, that concealment seems too convenient. Supporters argue that erasing Dagobert II's burial was tantamount to breaking a chain. If official succession of sacred blood could be mapped in stone, then his tomb would provide proof of continuity. Without it, generations that follow can be recast by chroniclers to look like natural heirs. This strategy shifts power from biology to narrative. What you cannot disprove, you suppress. By removing Dagobert as visible reference, the Carolingian coup appears natural. The absence of his tomb becomes not an omission, but a protective measure, ensuring that no challenge could later rise from physical relics. The bee resurfaces here as crucial indicator. Bees in Merovingian context symbolize community tied by blood and inheritance. Carried into burial, they declared legitimacy beyond military conquest. Napoleon's adoption centuries later seems an almost theatrical act of recognition, as though world power in his hands was bolstered by imagery from a bloodline deliberately folded into secrecy. Some whisper he resurrected the bee precisely because the fleur-de-lis bound rulers too closely to papal approval, whereas bees echoed a lineage older and autonomous. His empire through bees thus looked back past Bourbon dynasties into an archaic claim that traced itself into mystery. There is human weight to this silence. Imagine a mason tasked with repairing a collapsed section near the abbey's crypt centuries after Dagobert's time. He notices a bricked arch that leads nowhere, dust clinging in his beard. Does he report it, or does he smooth the surface again under order of those above him? Written evidence tells us gaps exist, but the physical act of sealing required hands, mortar, sweat. Real people obeyed the command to obstruct access to cavities containing bones and perhaps artifacts. Their obedience ensured that modern archaeologists meet dead ends where corridors should run. Silence in archives often corresponds with literal walls underground. The larger picture is this. Absent graves often echo political fears more than accidents. In ancient Egypt, names were chipped away from cartouches when heirs deemed them inconvenient. In Incan memory, royal mummies were sometimes hidden or destroyed when rival rulers feared renewed legitimacy claims. Erasure of physical remains has always served power by controlling which ancestors can be called upon for validation. Saint-Denis, far from anomaly, fits a global pattern where missing tombs whisper louder than intact monuments. The absence is not neglect, the absence is strategy. And so Dagobert II's elusive resting place takes on mythic weight. If indeed his heir lived underground in secrecy, then concealing his burial was vital. If instead his dynasty died with his assassination, concealing his tomb was still useful, blocking later claims or legends from clinging to it. In either case, Saint-Denis is less a repository of commemoration than a carefully curated archive, where what is missing tells the true story. Watched by bees lingers like a riddle, guardianship through symbol, continuity without record, The question lingers when you stand near those tombs today. Why single out Dagobert for obscurity while peers receive ornate remembrance? Was his bloodline considered too volatile to acknowledge? Did chroniclers fear that a visible tomb would keep heretical theories alive? Supporters suggest that bones and artifacts still rest in those sealed chambers, potentially capable of confirming lineages hidden for centuries. Critics dismiss the idea as imagination grafted onto gaps, but the unease remains when you feel the change in air pressure near blocked corridors or trace mortar lines leading into vanished vaults. Sometimes restraint leaves stronger residue than proclamation. In the quiet of the cathedral surrounded by effigies carved in marble, you begin to sense the pattern. Every stone tells a story of permanence, yet one king's physical trace is tangled, partial, unstable. Bees hover here like shadows, symbols without sound. Napoleon listened to them, chroniclers avoided them, and modern investigators find their wings beating faintly whenever inventories lapse into vagueness. The mystery is not solved by excavation, nor by catalogues. It clings to gaps and thresholds, to what seems close but just out of reach. Why would Dagobert's remains alone be cast into obscurity when others lie in plain view? What danger did his life or his lineage still pose centuries later? If he truly carried memory of sacred descent, then his tomb would have spoken too loudly. Better perhaps to ensure it vanished into contradictory pages and sealed rooms, which leaves us with a cathedral of stone that testifies not only to what survives, but to what has been hidden. The missing tombs at Saint-Denis, together with that cryptic inscription about bees, suggest a policy of concealment rather than accident. Napoleon felt its weight, gestured towards silence he could not fully expose. That silence is still there, heavy as stones pressed into vaults. If graves fall mute, ink may still speak. In the 20th century, dossiers surfaced that rearranged Europe's history. To them we now turn, pages that seem to break the crypt's long silence. The scene begins in Paris, in the hushed halls of the Bibliothèque Nationale, the largest public library in France. Picture the smell of old bindings there, leather spines with faded lettering, ink that had soaked into vellum or cheap government paper decades earlier. A visitor in 1956 could walk those aisles unnoticed for hours, gloves on, turning over catalogue entries that bore simple dates and signatures. Among the dust and routine bureaucratic storage, though, something unsettling appeared. A folder of genealogical charts, complete with ornate seals and elaborate annotations, seemed suddenly to tell a story of kingship continuing far longer than official history allowed. They felt heavier than their paper. On the surface, they looked like archival material of little consequence. To those who studied them with patience, however, they opened the door into a much larger narrative. The one who introduced this material was Pierre Plantard, a name that by itself might have drawn little attention. Yet the documents attached to him under the banner of the Priory of Sion presented themselves as nothing less than proof of continuity from the Merovingians. The papers described a line stretching from Dagobert II, assassinated in 679, through later centuries of European nobility and into the modern day. On the covers were stamps that looked convincingly official. Inside, cross-references between obscure medieval chronicles were written in neat hand. Genealogical trees connected known rulers to forgotten heirs, weaving a thread through the centuries. There were even references to property deeds, inheritance disputes, and alliances created through marriage. The voice of the archive was not dramatic but administrative, quiet in tone yet powerful through the sheer volume of detail. To those encountering the dossier for the first time, the effect could be oddly persuasive. These were not bold claims of treasure or prophecy scribbled in haste. Every entry echoed the phrasing of real charters. Schedules of descent showed where one house merged into another, how bloodlines split, and which heirs inherited obscure parcels of land. Skeptics noted quickly that the priory itself was not an ancient order, but an invention of the 20th century. But even they admitted the documents showed thorough knowledge of noble families, feudal grants, and medieval legal conventions. The very plainness of the details made them feel authentic. If they were forgeries, then they were crafted with unsettling precision. What amplified the strangeness was the mixture of names. Many figures could be verified in medieval chronicles. Bertrand de Blanchefort, the Grand Master of the Templars, appeared alongside Godfrey de Bouillon, who led the First Crusade and claimed Jerusalem in 1099. These were not fabricated individuals but recognisable agents of real history. Yet between them ran connections less easy to confirm, shadowy individuals who appeared only in these genealogies. Whole lines of descent linked famous crusaders with unknown heirs supposedly carrying Merovingian blood. The boundary between attested history and invention blurred. Try to untangle it, and the page resisted separation. Authentic events and speculative construction shared the same ink. The Lobineau genealogies, part of these dossiers, extended across dozens of pages. They offered clean diagrams of descent repeated with meticulous regularity. Descendants of Dagobert II appeared to resurface repeatedly, often tied into lesser-known noble families in rural France. Supporting details included property transfers, dowries, even obscure references to land rights. You could follow an estate inherited by an 11th century widow appearing again in the 16th century notary papers. At times, the precision seemed so careful it felt copied from real registries. Critics counter that this was exactly the problem. The forgers cannibalized genuine archival material, embedding real parchment sources into a lattice of invention. But the effect was the same. Once read, the genealogies unsettle the neat closure of history. Their arrival in 1956 was not random. France at mid-century nurtured fascination with alternative histories, hidden societies, and lore threaded through the medieval past. The trauma of world wars, the lure of esoteric renewal, and a revival of regional identities made cultural soil fertile for such revelations. The dossiers arrived before works of popular fiction transformed Grail theory into mass-market mythology. Their placement in the National Library among authentic collections granted them a veneer of seriousness. Anyone browsing the shelves could come across them and treat them as research rather than conspiracy. At a moment when archivists were cataloguing immense quantities of documents, a slim thread like this could fit without raising alarm. The format itself persuaded as much as the content. Instead of bold proclamations, the dossiers resembled bureaucratic records. Property disputes were described in dry legal French, with dates and marginalia. Marriage contracts listed witnesses. Such mundanity created an impression of authenticity. The sheer banality seemed to argue against forgery. Why would anyone fabricate endless lists of minor landholders if not to reflect underlying reality? Dramatic claims attract skeptics. Tedium disarms them. Many who first studied the dossiers found themselves debating not whether a forgery was possible, but how deeply it ran through actual records. One scholar of the time noted privately that the trouble was not identifying mistakes, but that the mistakes blended seamlessly with facts. Reading them was like following a song where genuine notes and dissonant chords were tangled together. You could spot the discord only if you knew the tune by heart. Few had such mastery of obscure genealogies. Plantard, or whoever composed the texts, seemed to know this advantage. The average reader of family trees, however careful, lacked the means to separate veracity from fabrication. The strength of the material lay not in a single convincing assertion, but in the impossible amount of cross-checking required to unseat it. Some whisper that the dossiers were not simply the product of one man's imagination, but a deliberate seeding of information designed to revive a dormant claim. If so, the intent was not to shock the public, but to prepare the ground for future acceptance. Place the documents quietly in national collections, allow them to circulate among researchers, and over time the myths might take root again. The slow effect is more lasting than immediate disclosure. Even skeptics unknowingly help perpetuate such stories once they engage and publish rebuttals, because each citation keeps the material alive. In this way, the bloodline myth remained in circulation long before popular novels gave it mass attention. Others dismiss the notion that the dossiers contain any core truth. They suggest the aim was personal aggrandizement, a way for Plantard to insert himself into grander genealogies. Yet even then, the choice of materials reveals ambition. Instead of crafting a lineage bound to the Carolingians or Capetians, better documented dynasties, he chose the Merovingians, whose legacy was shadowed by missing heirs and erased chronicles. Their semi-mythical aura matched perfectly. The forger, or visionary, rooted his work in a dynasty already half-hidden, creating a plausible container for the secret thread. That choice ensured the story would always appear both possible and unverifiable, walking a narrow path between faith and skepticism. The cultural impact was broad, even if the dossiers remained an obscure curiosity at first. Regional enthusiasts, amateur historians, and seekers of arcane truth began copying passages, extending the trees into new inventions. By the 1960s, the material spread through Europe's blossoming countercultural underground. Occult societies mined them for ritual significance. Alternative press adapted passages into speculative journalism. Scholars wrote cautious notes trying to correct distortions, thereby adding citations that looked like endorsement. Slowly, the papers achieved a strange half-life. Not recognised by mainstream historians, not dismissed fully either, always hovering in the space between archive and imagination. In hindsight, the dossier's greatest strength lay in their manipulation of tone. They avoided sensational descriptions of relics or divine visions, instead embedding mythology in legalistic prose. That gave them exactly the appearance of authenticity that could survive scrutiny. Genuine archival scholars could dismiss them line by line, but the broader public, attuned more to literary impression than professional debate, found little reason not to at least entertain them. For many, the simple fact that they existed in the National Library lent them credibility. A forgery placed in personal possession would look desperate. A genealogical table filed among authentic manuscripts acquired authority simply by location. Supporters suggest that if fragments of truth were preserved in those files, they were hidden like veins of ore within ordinary rock. One must crush the mass, sift carefully, and detect the occasional glimmer. Was there an authentic family chart smuggled into the dossier? A real inheritance document copied and extended into fabrication? Critics counter that evaluating such mixtures is impossible. Once known frames are deliberately entangled with invention. The synthesis is indistinguishable from fraud. Yet the possibility remains alluring precisely because it cannot be disproven absolutely. Ambiguity becomes the secret ally of the story. Imagine sitting with one of the genealogical tables tracing the fine lines between names. Under the lamp, the ink almost fades. You move your finger from Godfrey de Bouillon through a chain of less accounts, and suddenly arrive at Dagobert II's supposed descendants. Nowhere in formal histories does this appear, yet here it is set plainly, as though the omission were the true scandal rather than invention. That tactile engagement, the sense of parchment under your hand, the tremor of lineage drawn through centuries creates its own conviction. Evidence and suggestion blur simply through human contact with the page. By the final years of the 20th century, echoes of these dossiers shaped entire genres of conspiracy literature. The seeds planted in 1956 found soil in novels and documentaries. Their bloodline claims became plotlines before they turned into urban legends. In this sense, the document succeeded. Whether the intention was deception, myth-making, or a cautious transmission of real inheritance memory, they carried the story forward. Through their quiet storage in the library, they influenced imaginations across generations. Even now, when the Priory of Sion has been thoroughly investigated as Plantard's mid-century invention, the genealogical mystery still endures. The Priory of Sion dossiers remain ambiguous, not clumsy fakes, not undeniable truths, but a carefully composed braid of both. They forced scholars and story lovers alike to navigate the thin line between archive and invention. The questions they opened still hang unresolved. Did someone intend to seed genealogical fragments into accessible collections waiting for notice? Or did a forger simply stumble into uncanny resonance by dressing imagination in the costume of history? The uncertainty is itself the enduring legacy. Some whisper that guardians of memory may have used forgery as cover, ensuring fragments could pass unseen until the age was ready. Critics counter with confidence that it was all an elaborate game. But either way, the papers pulled the old silence of Dagobert's missing line back to the surface. And if the dossiers encourage us to think of guardianship, one must wonder where such guardians might have hidden their more dangerous proof. Charts and property lists suggest only continuity, not possession of sacred memory. For that, supporters suggest the keepers looked beyond France, toward lands already rich with sacred legend. The trail reaches past the shelves of Paris into the stones of Jerusalem, to the foundations of Solomon's Temple, where a future order of knights would spend years underground in search of secrets that could reframe Europe's understanding of blood and power. The streets of Jerusalem in 1119 crackled with heat by midday, white light bouncing off the limestone and blinding the eyes of men already heavy in armour. Pilgrims passed in slow lines, clusters of them clutching satchels and gourds, chanted prayers mingling with the calls of traders selling figs and pottery. Among the countless processions was a very different cluster. 9 knights, little known then, swearing that they had come to protect Christian travellers crossing the roadways. What few noticed was that, instead of riding out every week to guard caravans or repelling raiders, the men spent much of their hours inside the old precincts of the Temple Mount. Stones still jutted in ragged ribs from the ruins of Solomon's Temple, shattered centuries earlier. The knights were often seen slipping into shadowed passageways beneath it, with tools in hand rather than swords. Their spades went into the earth, not into battle. For nearly a decade, the Order's outward role barely matched its claim. They were supposed to be guardians, yet accounts from the era show little evidence of patrols or escorts. Instead, the few records that survive hint at dirt under fingernails, carts of rubble hauled away quietly, and strange storage of items brought up from the underground. The locals noted the activity but found little reason to interfere. Jerusalem was a patchwork of powers then, and men digging in ruins did not seem so threatening compared with larger conflicts. Still, a question remains. Why would sworn knights abandon battlefield duties for the work of miners? Some whisper it was piety expressed as recovery, an attempt to reclaim holy remnants buried since Rome's sacking. Others suggest a less simple motive, one bound to secrets of inheritance and memory better left underground. By the time these men emerged from their decade beneath the stones, they were no longer obscure. When they returned to Europe, doors opened that had once been shut. Donations poured in from lords who had never met them. Kings recognised a power in their order beyond what 9 impoverished knights could summon by arms alone. A new aura of secrecy surrounded them. They carried themselves not merely as soldiers, but as curators of knowledge too dangerous to display. Their sudden wealth and prestige begged explanation. Critics claimed it flowed through pious generosity, yet the pace and scale of change felt unnatural. Supporters of other theories see in it the glimmer of something else. Documents uncovered, artifacts of reverence, or trapped lines of genealogy unexpectedly made visible. Archaeological surveys of the Temple Mount uncover evidence of ancient subterranean passages sealed since the Second Destruction. Caverns lie beneath, where only fragments of sunlight filter in through cracks. Supporters of alternative claims suggest that the knights did not simply happen upon ordinary relics, but may have unearthed spaces undisturbed for centuries. Picture the moment. Firelight crawling across stone, strange marks surfacing, scrolls brittle yet legible enough to alter inheritance itself. Even if much is speculative, The persistence of these suggestions hints at not just treasure, but legacy, something potent enough to reframe entire dynasties. The change in the order was stark. 9 obscure knights should have remained a modest garrison. Instead, within a generation, the name of the Templars carried thunder across Europe. They became bankers to kings, possessors of fortresses, and wielders of influence that rivaled popes. Battle competence alone does not account for such velocity. Their financial systems, the letters of credit they pioneered, the secure channels of wealth between continents, came from knowledge that seemed premature for their time. One wonders whether scrolls retrieved from underground chambers contained not only sacred lore but practical structures, economic patterns taken from earlier civilizations, refined and then unleashed at a moment apt for advantage. The real question hovers: did they guard a legacy or seize it for leverage? If their spades uncovered genealogical records tying Jesus' name to descendants woven into European lines, their choice to guard rather than announce would carry weight. To proclaim such a discovery would bring instant condemnation. To hide it and to guard it would bring leverage, silent but potent. Some whisper the Pope himself sanctioned their digging, while others counter that knowledge flowed without his understanding, placing the Church uneasily beside an order suddenly holding cards it could not control. Their secrecy took on ritual forms. Initiates spoke of elders who carried knowledge but forbade its naming. Witness accounts from later centuries describe rituals strange for knights bound to Christendom. Oaths made in shadows, symbols sketched into earth before being wiped away. All of it suggests not merely military loyalty, but stewardship of something unspeakable. Guardianship, not conquest. Custodianship, not spoil. In that distinction lies the seed of centuries of suspicion. The transformation manifested visibly in the architecture they built. Templar commanderies scattered across Europe shared common patterns. Stone circles, careful alignments, geometries echoing the temple structure far from Jerusalem's reach. Some designs echoed biblical temples and older pagan patterns, as if fragments of wisdom had been spliced into stone. Ratios and angles became code, architecture as lineage. The men themselves gave hints they carried something too great for display. Chroniclers describe an almost obsessive secrecy binding their order, stricter than that of other military fraternities. Their clothing bore symbols few understood, but brothers were trained to recognise. Their prayers included lines not shared with wider congregations. Were they protecting fragile scrolls, coded family lines, or talismans said to guarantee divine favour? Or were they simply building myth around themselves to ensure loyalty? Whatever the answer, Europe responded as if something genuine lay behind the curtain. Consider how their rise unsettled the very balance of Christendom. Popes alternately courted and feared them. Monarchs borrowed from them but envied their wealth. Pilgrims trusted them with lives and belongings. Their identity shifted from battlefield to balance sheet. Monks turned bankers whose reach rivaled crowns. This displacement of role suggests that what they carried out of Jerusalem was not armour or gold, but knowledge capable of generating authority across borders. Knowledge travels lighter than trunks yet reshapes greater empires. Some critics dismiss these suggestions, insisting that the order's growth stemmed from effective networking and the fervour of crusader states. They argue that political opportunity explains the donations and prominence. And yet, the order's first decade cannot be explained away so easily. 9 knights digging in dust while pilgrims passed unguarded. Their mission statement and their practice stand at odds. This tension fuels the speculation that what they discovered dictated everything later. Their order may never have been purely martial. From the beginning, it may have been excavation, in service of a truth buried deliberately. Human voices whisper through the record. One can picture a young knight, not wealthy or noble by origin, lowering himself by rope into a chamber untouched since Jerusalem burned. Dust thicker than breath, air stale as death. He holds his torch forward, and on the stone walls marks appear, lines of a genealogy perhaps, names etched by an earlier hand. Whether fact or fancy, that picture carries the weight of why the Templar story endures. Men sworn to open battle become the very opposite, guardians of buried heritage. In later centuries, accusations against the order would frame them as heretics, idolaters, corrupters. Yet at their root may rest this first act of secrecy. Once you guard what others deem unfit for the light, every ritual around it grows strange, every action cloaked, every prayer tinged with suspicion. If the buried legacy involved a holy bloodline, or relics contradicting papal authority, the need for discretion was absolute, and absolute discretion only breeds deeper myth. This is why speculation continues to circle the Temple Mount like wind across its stones. Were those 9 knights naive servants turned into keepers of holy knowledge, or opportunists who excavated treasures never meant to leave? The question lingers because their silence was never ordinary, it was purposeful. They returned to Europe wielding invisible leverage, and each fortress they built, each ledger they opened, carried the resonance of secrets found below. The Templars' first decade is remembered less for battles than for shadows. What they unearthed has remained locked between rumour and reverence, too explosive to confirm, too enduring to erase. And from that hush rose the most powerful military order of the Middle Ages. Their tools scraped stone, but what they unearthed scraped at memory itself. As years passed, whispers gathered not of relics, but of codes and hidden languages. Rumours placed their devotion around a single cryptic word, one that has puzzled inquisitors and historians alike. That word was Baphomet, a cipher whose meaning may hold the next key to what they truly sought to protect. The year was 1307, and the air in Paris was thick with dread. Dawn raids dragged the Knights Templar from their beds and cells, accusations inked before questions were even spoken. What followed were interrogations branded as confessions, squeezed from bodies on racks or with iron pressed against flesh. Again and again, a single word surfaced in the scattered parchments that recorded these forced testimonies: Baphomet. A mysterious head, bearded, sometimes speaking prophecies, sometimes granting wisdom, sometimes nothing more than a name that left the inquisitors assured they had uncovered heresy. It was said the knights bent before it, kissed it, even worshipped. When you read the trial fragments today, the descriptions blur together, inconsistent and contradictory. One Templar says the head had 4 feet, another claims it glowed. Others insist it was simply a skull. What emerges is no idol, but a spectre born of duress. The repetition of the term, not the consistency of its description, carried the weight. It became proof of blasphemy in the eyes of the Church. Yet even at the time, whispers ran through Europe that the charges were political theatre, designed to dismantle an order that had grown too wealthy, too autonomous, and perhaps too knowing. Still, the word Baphomet refuses to vanish, lingering like a stubborn ghost at the edge of every record of the trials. Some supporters of alternative reading suggest that Baphomet was never meant to describe a head at all. They note that words shift form as they move across languages and scripts. In medieval Latin script, transcription errors were common when Arabic, Greek and French terms collided. One interpretation links the term to the Greek phrase baphe meteos, or baptism of wisdom. If this root holds, then the word describes not an idol, but an initiation rite, a symbolic immersion into hidden knowledge carried by the Templars. Rather than a statue in a vault, Baphomet could represent the continuation of wisdom outside sanctioned channels, a kind of alternate baptism passed down in secrecy. Others point to a more earthly connection, the resemblance of Baphomet to Mahomet, an early European rendering of the Prophet Muhammad's name. If this resemblance is more than coincidence, then the accusation may reflect the suspicions of an order that had lived and fought in close contact with the Islamic world. Crusaders encountered Sufi mystics, astronomical texts, and medical knowledge in Arabic translation. Some whisper the Templars absorbed fragments of these traditions, so foreign they could be branded heresy. Baphomet may have been less revelation than slur. Whatever the accuracy, the term's haziness is essential. The confessions never coalesce into a clear object. Instead, each testimony shifts shape, as though the knights could not, or dared not, fix its meaning. This uncertainty alone invites speculation that Baphomet functioned as cipher, a word designed to obscure what could not be openly spoken. If the Templars had indeed discovered documents beneath the Temple Mount, some imagine the term was shorthand for a lineage they vowed to protect. The guardianship of blood would be disguised with language vague enough to evade casual scrutiny, but precise enough for initiates to recognise. The fog thickens when you consider the Chinon parchment. Written in 1308, it records the interrogation of senior Templars not by hostile inquisitors, but by papal envoys. In it, the knights acknowledge unusual practices yet deny heresy. To the surprise of many historians, Pope Clement V absolved them of heretical charges. The purge that followed was not driven by theology, but orchestrated by King Philip IV of France, who craved their treasure and owed them vast sums of debt. If the Pope quietly absolved their leaders, the accusation of heresy collapses into theatre. The question becomes, what knowledge did they carry that was too dangerous for public airing, yet too sacred for Rome to openly destroy? Here the term Baphomet takes on new light. Imagine it not as a statue locked away in some cavernous vault, but as a coded name whispered in ceremonial gatherings. For some, it represented the baptism of wisdom, an initiation into truths suppressed by the Church. For others, it signified absorbed traditions, Eastern and Western beliefs fused inside the order's rituals. But if the theory of bloodline guardianship holds, then Baphomet was less a symbol of worship, and more a code naming the lineage itself. To plead guilty to honouring Baphomet under torture would then equate to confessing they guarded the hidden heirs of Christ. An admission wrapped in a word no inquisitor could quite pass. There's a quiet irony in how the charge of idolatry hinges on a phantom object. Scholars who line the records side by side often remark on the lack of physical evidence. No carved heads were ever produced, no relics displayed, nothing tangible beyond confession scrolls written under threat. In medieval Europe, heresy trials usually showed the object of offence, books, talismans, statues. The Templars' trials offered only testimony. The absence only deepened suspicion. Was there nothing to show because there was never an idol at all? Perhaps there was only a secret folded into language, safer left undefined. Supporters of the bloodline theory argue that Baphomet became the perfect mask. An accuser heard idolatry in the description of a head. A Templar, naming the same, spoke of genealogy or baptism of wisdom, without saying so directly. One word for two audiences, ensuring secrecy endured even under the hot pinch of torture. Critics counter that this interpretation stretches too far, that medieval scribes simply twisted the name Muhammad into a heretical boogeyman. For them, the Templars' exposure to foreign belief was enough to justify suspicion, without need for hidden bloodlines. Both views find no solid ground, yet the mystery persists because neither resolves the inconsistency in testimonies. Picture a single knight in custody, sweating in a wooden chair under torchlight. His interrogators press him for the name of the idol. He speaks it once, Baphomet, hoping the word itself is both shield and surrender. Shield because it satisfies the Inquisitor's hunger without revealing truth. Surrender because it gives them the sound of heresy. Yet to his brothers of the Order, far from that room, the word may mean something completely different. A lineage, a rite, a baptism of secret insight. To hold one word in two meanings might have been the final act of loyalty the knight could offer. The papacy's absolution adds weight to these shadows. If the Pope knew of these practices and forgave them, then the word Baphomet must not have carried the danger official records suggest. Or rather, the true danger lay not in idolatry but in what the word concealed. The Vatican's silence after Chinon reads as strategic omission. Enough knowledge was acknowledged to absolve, but not enough revealed to destabilise the order of Christendom. Better to let the knights perish as heretics in secular flames than risk shaking apostolic authority by confessing the truth of what was hidden. In this light, the purge of the Templars must be seen less as a triumph of orthodoxy than as a means of containment, to destroy an order that had grown too close to forbidden knowledge, too intertwined with whispers of sacred blood. A clean break between church stability and the dangerous truths possibly unearthed under Jerusalem. History writes Baphomet as the mark of heresy. Speculation suggests it was the disguise of knowledge forbidden to reach daylight. The cipher endures because it resists clear translation, much like the suppressed stories of bloodlines themselves. For centuries, writers from occultists to scholars of esoteric traditions tried to anchor Baphomet to an image. The goat-headed idol appears only in the 19th century with Eliphas Levi, an invention to fill the void. But the medieval record contains no such figure. Nothing but the pliable word, bending under pressure but refusing to break. The enigma of Baphomet may never resolve. What remains are its contradictions, head or code, idol or initiation, blasphemy or guardianship. But the broader picture suggests this much. If the Pope absolved the knights while allowing their destruction, then silence itself was the safeguard. Better to let secrecy burn than to confess openly what cross and crown could not survive. The truth perhaps lay not in an object misremembered, but in a lineage too volatile to name. And if secrets this delicate could be twisted through trial testimony, then it begs the next question. Where else might scraps of the same knowledge rest today? Not in chancery records open to every scholar, but in writings buried to avoid flame, hidden gospels in desert caves, and sealed libraries where forbidden genealogies were filed under lock and key. Sometimes what vanishes from the page tells the louder story, and in this case, the faint trace of Baphomet hints that the written record was never the true archive of this mystery at all. A single sheet of vellum lies before you, the surface worn smooth by centuries of handling. Under angled light, faint traces of an earlier text peek through, strokes erased and overwritten, ghost lines that resist vanishing. Scholars know this as a palimpsest, a page scraped of one message so another could be written in its place. It is a haunting image, history rewritten literally over itself, with earlier words left a whisper invisibly beneath. Each fragment hints at what was written, and what someone wished forgotten. In those fading outlines, some see the silhouettes of gospels deemed unfit for survival. The Vatican secret archives stretch for more than 85 kilometres of shelving, a subterranean labyrinth beneath Rome said to contain every letter, proclamation, and papal record across 2 millennia. Yet amid the endless cataloguing, whole centuries of early Christian writing do not appear in public registers. The gaps create an eerie symmetry, sections of time where you would expect hundreds of documents, but instead find none. Officially, poor preservation or war might explain loss, but others wonder if these absences speak of more deliberate choices, materials sealed away to prevent their influence on doctrine. The shelving itself could be complete, but access remains guided by keys that open some doors and keep others shut. The revelation of Nag Hammadi in 1945 sharpened this suspicion. Near the Egyptian town, farmers unearthed 13 leather-bound codices, hidden in jars since antiquity. Inside were 52 Gnostic texts written in Coptic. For the first time, the world read words long assumed destroyed. Among them, the Gospel of Philip quietly introduced Magdalene in terms not found elsewhere, calling her the companion of Jesus. The Greek term koinonos fuels debate. Does it mean spiritual partner in faith, or does it imply marriage? The text even alludes to sacred marriage rituals, practices foreign to later orthodoxy. Suddenly, what had been missing from official gospel narrative flickered back into view like ink beneath a scraping knife. Holding one of those books today, bound in brittle leather, you can sense the weight of suppression. These writings had been carefully hidden, and for 1500 years they succeeded in staying hidden. It raises the unsettling thought: if 52 texts could slip through the cracks and survive in desert jars, how many more remain encased in libraries, filed under category codes deliberately steering scholars away? Whole inventories may exist, recorded faithfully in monastery catalogues centuries ago, yet the manuscripts themselves are gone, vanished not through accident, but through removal. Consider the monastery libraries across Europe during the 12th century. Detailed inventories listed Gospels, Acts, letters, and Apocrypha copied carefully by monks in scriptoria. Later reviews of the same collections, sometimes only generations apart, reveal entries missing. Names once there are erased. It is as though some invisible hand combed through, reducing the record until its shape matched approved canon. Critics argue deterioration or misfiled manuscripts account for this. Yet the consistency of loss, early writings that complicate official accounts, suggest something more measured. When you find gaps of the same character across different libraries, it resembles policy more than chance. People often imagine the Library of Alexandria's fall as a single dramatic inferno, knowledge consumed in flame, yet evidence points to a slower unravelling. Scrolls vanished not in one catastrophe, but through centuries of selective extraction. Texts were carried away or quietly culled, often those carrying interpretations at odds with rising orthodoxies. It is plausible that genealogical writings, those connecting sacred figures to possible descendants, were siphoned from Alexandria into private or ecclesiastical collections long before anyone burned a library. Memory management often happens through quiet withdrawal rather than violent destruction. Far from Egypt, Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland holds another curious clue. Built in the 15th century, its stone carvings include references scholars struggle to explain: plants native to the Americas before Columbus, mason marks tied to vanished orders, and beneath, allegedly, hidden chambers. Among its fixtures are stone shelves sized with uncanny precision to hold 52 manuscripts. The echo of Nag Hammadi's discovery is too neat for some to call chance. Supporters suggest this was a site prepared to mirror that library, a second ark for writings officially disavowed. Critics counter with caution: correlation is not causation. Yet Rosslyn has long invited speculation precisely because its design seems pointedly symbolic, a structure built not only for worship but for encoded storage. Modern technology has added depth to these suspicions. Scholars use infrared scans to pierce the top layers of manuscript pages. Beneath familiar gospel passages, erased marginalia sometimes surface. Notes scribbled by earlier monks who copied lineages, comments about rival traditions, even diagrams that suggest genealogical mapping. Palimpsest analysis increasingly reveals a practice of concealment. To preserve a page, new ink covered old. In doing so, the overwrite became a tool of censorship, yet also ensured fragments would survive invisibly for centuries until technology brought them back into sight. In a paradoxical way, the attempt to erase preserved the proof of erasure itself. One fragment in particular illustrates this tension. Beneath a later devotion to a saint, faint writing traces out what appears to be a list of names. The outline of Mariam repeats in a margin, alongside a term resembling syngenes, meaning kin. Not enough to prove anything, yet provocative in its survival. It suggests that even while orthodoxy was ascendant, scribes remembered, or at least hinted, that family associations ran alongside theology. Such fragments offer tantalizing glimpses of what fuller records might reveal if access were granted or pages more fully restored. Even the terminology of secret archives holds a peculiar weight. Officially, the Vatican uses the Latin Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, where secretum simply means private. Yet over time, the aura of secrecy has only thickened. Shelving measured in kilometres, doors closed to all but select scholars, cataloguing designed less for discovery than for control. If absence appears coordinated, so too does obscurity. You might be granted access to a section, but you are unlikely to find materials that would unseat doctrine. Files can be scattered among harmless ones, a strategy as effective as burning. Retain the text, but hide it where no thread reveals its meaning. The discovery of Nag Hammadi reminded the world that obliteration often produces survival elsewhere. What is destroyed in one corner can resurface in another jar, cave or chapel shelf. And so speculation grows. Could there be forgotten gospels still in sealed rooms of the Vatican? Manuscripts whose very catalogue references are suppressed? Some whisper entire genealogical records of the early church, perhaps family trees linking Mary Magdalene to dynastic heirs, were copied and passed underground. If a jar in Egypt held such explosive fragments, why not a vault under Rome? Others dismiss this, insisting the archives conceal nothing more sensational than administrative detail. Yet the suspicion lingers precisely because we know suppression can walk hand in hand with preservation. Parallel to this is the theme of erasure turned artifact. The act of striking out a word, removing a volume or disguising a text often leaves trace evidence as compelling as survival. In some monasteries, erased pages glow faint under lamplight, while in Alexandria the absence of scrolls signals what ideas threatened most. In Rosslyn Chapel, the shelved-up mentions themselves serve as silent testimony. In the Vatican, kilometres of sealed shelving embody a choice to preserve privately what cannot circulate publicly. These are not accidents. They carry the rhythm of decisions repeated across centuries. The deeper realization is not only about doctrine denied, but lineage concealed. The lost Gospels often focus on authority flowing through relationship. Jesus and Magdalene, female disciples, children implied by kinship terms. When such texts vanish from canon, it preserves a model of faith rooted in church structure rather than family inheritance. If Christ had a living bloodline, sanctity would flow through veins, not sacraments. The stakes are seismic. A world defined by apostolic succession would suddenly face challenges from households rather than altars. Memory of that possibility had to be pruned repeatedly, each time knowledge threatened to restore itself. Picture scholars lifting fragments under ultraviolet light, outlines of letters trembling back into view. They cannot declare with certainty what was once written, only that something was written there at all. That ambiguity may be more powerful than clarity. It suggests suppression without handing tidy proof, filling imagination with questions as sharp as evidence. At Rosslyn, at Nag Hammadi, in sealed Vatican rooms, the same pattern unfolds. Preservation by removal, revelation by absence. The gaps tug on the mind precisely because they are deliberate. What was hidden may not only redefine belief but redraw identity. Genealogical notes beneath gospel passages hint at entire parallel histories where Christ's story continues in households, marriages and heirs. Such materials, if released in full, could destabilize centuries of Christian doctrine tied to hierarchy and ritual. It explains the careful management of information, the preference for sealed shelving over open flame. Erasure leaves fewer scars than fire, yet its results can be more thorough. Fewer questions are asked when the crime leaves no smoke, and what remains suppressed may yet lie waiting. Palimpsest fragments whisper beneath ink. Monasteries still guard inventories with missing entries. The Vatican shelves keep their sealed doors. The lost Gospels do not simply tell us of alternate visions of faith. They remind us how memory itself can be crafted, dismantled and rewritten. Each gap is a statement in its own right. The quiet carries meaning equal to the words that survive. Even so, memory is never empty. It lingers in erased pages, shadow texts, absent catalogue entries that circle silently back to the same suggestion. That lineage itself once played a far greater role than officials allowed. And if so, the lost Gospels are not simply about belief, but about blood, guardianship and the struggle to choose who tells history. And yet, even the longest shelf of manuscripts is only half the story. The greater power lies not in what texts exist, but in what names are missing. From vanished heirs to redacted chronicles, suppression extends beyond pages into history itself. The silence has been carefully arranged, a muted art with consequences stretching into kingship, faith, and identity. Now the frame shifts again, carrying us from hidden chambers of parchment to the wide landscape of absence. Chronicles rewritten, archives sealed, dynasties refashioned. This is not simple forgetting, but curated forgetting. History isn't only written by victors, it is also managed by those who know that unspoken gaps can shape memory more effectively than grand declarations. The reign of the Merovingians came to an official end in 751, when Pepin the Short deposed the last of their line and replaced sacred ancestry with papal blessing. On the surface, it looked like a simple dynastic coup, but once you read deeper into the chronicles, you noticed the faint marks of a larger project. Genealogy reshaped, documents reframed, symbols stripped of one meaning and refitted with another. In the quiet black ink of those annals, an entire people's lineage was repositioned in the cultural imagination, not erased outright, but rewritten until myth replaced history. The gesture is subtle. Instead of burning relics, they were retained. Instead of destroying manuscripts, they were amended. When Pepin took the throne, the chroniclers began to recast Merovingian kingship as a curiosity, a fading relic of an age that was never quite Christian enough. In this reframing, their sacred long hair, once regarded as the living crown of their divine power, became an eccentric survival, a quaint detail without true substance. With each retelling, the dynasty receded a little further into mist, until they were remembered more like dreamers or mystics than rulers who once commanded soldiers and courts. The coup did not merely cut off one line of inheritance, it announced a new system where legitimacy would flow from papal sanction rather than ancestral claims. Relics played their part in this controlled transformation. The baptismal oil once said to have descended from heaven in a dove-shaped vessel lost its living connection to Merovingian coronations and was absorbed into the wider story of papal authority. Bees taken from Childeric's tomb, once signifiers of continuity between king and lineage, were later folded into heraldry in ways that removed their dynastic sting. The fleur-de-lis came to stand not for sacral descent but for the crown of France under Capetian and Valois kings. The old emblems were not discarded, they were kept, polished, and reassigned, precisely so their previous genealogy could no longer be traced. Erasure functions not only through absence, but through reinterpretation. The Albigensian Crusades several centuries later followed the same path on a harsher scale. Officially it was a campaign against heresy, directed at the Cathars of Languedoc, whose teachings deviated from orthodox doctrine. But look carefully at what was destroyed. Not random heterodoxy, but traditions that gave prominence to the sacred feminine and suggested authority could exist outside Rome's approval. Cathodualism, which gave space to feminine authority, echoed dangerous memories. Their eradication destroyed not just heresy, but a living archive of alternative succession. The cruelty of the sieges was matched by the precision of their effect. Memory itself was obliterated under the banner of restoring unity. The management of archives reflects the same logic. Step into a monastery library catalogue from the 12th century, and you notice oddities. Lists referring to writings that no longer exist, shelf marks that lead nowhere, or notes so vague they might have been written to confuse rather than clarify. In the Vatican's collection, stretches of centuries vanish into locked compartments and sealed corridors. Historians note how the arrangement itself acts as a form of control. Documents scattered across different series, connections severed by obscure filing systems, making reconstruction of alternative genealogies nearly impossible. You can imagine a diligent scholar copying references by candlelight, only to reach a dead end because the vital crosslink has been hidden inside a room he could never enter. Absence structured in shelves, stillness embedded in catalogues. A Christic bloodline, if ever proven, would overturn the very scaffolding that supported ecclesiastical hierarchy. Apostolic succession declares that authority flows through a chain of ordination, from Christ to Peter, to bishops, and finally to popes. It is a structure of hands resting upon heads, cementing legitimacy across centuries. Introduce a surviving family line into that equation, and suddenly the scaffolding collapses. If sanctity ran through inheritance of flesh, papal decree would yield to lineage, and every throne or altar derived from Rome would stand contested. The pressure of that risk may explain why church and crown partnered in strategies of curated forgetting. It was not enough to declare rivals heretical. Their memory itself had to be reshaped so that future generations would not even think to ask the forbidden questions. But forgetting rarely arrives as open destruction. Consider how relics were appropriated. A woman's skull in a reliquary, displayed as Magdalene's, was venerated not for descent but for penitence. Her image was shifted from matriarch to prostitute. Her gospel words were framed as warnings rather than testimonies. That act, repeated across sermons and art, neutralised the danger of bloodline. A holy mother becomes a repentant sinner. A carrier of possibility becomes a warning against female excess. This is how curated forgetting works, not through burning every manuscript, but by telling the story in new tones until the original timbre is lost beneath layers of reinterpretation. Look too at local memory. In small Provençal towns, villagers still repeated tales of the Magdalene coming ashore, yet their words were coded in ways that could be dismissed as simple folklore. Oral traditions are harder to confiscate but easier to ridicule. By relegating such tales to the category of peasant superstition, authorities ensured that they could survive without carrying weight in official annals. This type of forgetting permits survival, but survival without influence, like an echo locked inside a canyon, audible but irrelevant to the commands of kings and bishops. There is an irony here. While chronicles consciously erased, they often failed to cover their own seams. A sudden gap in genealogies, an heir mentioned in one text but not in another, a tomb left unnamed though neighbours are identified. Each becomes a quiet marker of where excision occurred. Readers today can notice the absences as clearly as footsteps leading off a path. The veil does not eliminate curiosity, it invites it. Still, for centuries, these gaps served their purpose. Most who read the chronicles took the silence as natural, the absent heirs as unworthy of mention, the errant shrines as eccentricities. For trained eyes, however, the pattern suggests more deliberate pruning than natural forgetting. Supporters of the bloodline idea argue that this pruning is systematic enough to amount to policy. Critics counter that medieval chroniclers were never as thorough as we imagine, and that gaps emerge naturally from lost parchment or careless copyists. Both positions have weight, yet whether by policy or chance, the effect is the same. A continuous vein of silence threading through the record, a hush that conveniently shields institutions from genealogical challenges. Let the frame widen for a moment. From Mesopotamia to Egypt to China, dynasties erased rivals through altered records. Europe's Christian story fits the same rhythm. Silence paired with substitution, memory reshaped into safer narratives. Imagine a monk copying chronicles in a candlelit scriptorium. The room smells of wax and ink. His hand pauses above a line naming an inconvenient heir. He sighs, looks over his shoulder, then skips onward. The word never reaches parchment. Generations later, no one knows the name was waiting there, breath held between ink and air. This is how curated forgetting feels at human scale, not as vast conspiracy, but as hundreds of small choices, each one a cut in the weave of memory. Together, they form a cloth smooth enough to hide the seams. The Carolingian coup is often praised as the moment when church and crown formed a partnership solid enough to shape Europe for centuries. Underneath, It is also the moment when memory of sacred descent first shifted underground. The authority to rule no longer flowed through hair or blood, but through approval granted by Rome. Kingship ceased to be hereditary sanctity and became a contract between throne and altar. That shift could not survive unless memory was managed, and so it was. Chronicles took on new tones, relics became reinterpreted, symbols gained new veneers until their older meanings blurred beyond recovery. Supporters suggest the pattern never ended. Each resurgence of bloodline lore met with reinforced dogma, vanished documents, softened explanations. The quiet itself tells the story, and even silence leaves traces. When chronicles and shelves fall mute, landscapes remember. Shrines, valleys and mountains become the archive, carrying what ink concealed. You step through the tall glass doors of the Bibliothèque Nationale as Paris exhales the muffled weight of a cool 1956 morning. The stone floors feel cold under your shoes, polished by centuries of scholars. Dust hangs just above the heavy oak tables, stirred each time a clerk pulls down another leather-spined ledger. In the stillness, a sheaf of papers waits, tucked into a file that official catalogues had overlooked. The dossier carries more than genealogies. It carries maps, lines and notations that don't merely sketch land, but arrange it into meaning. The marks look less like an archivist's work and more like a puzzle, tracing descent through terrain. To call these records family trees would be misleading. They drift between genealogy and geometry, arranging names alongside rivers, shrines and ruined keeps. The Lobino genealogies, the most intricate of the collection, pair royal descent with land in a way few historians expected. It was as though terrain itself had been recruited as witness, a permanent archive immune to fire or papal decree. Critics saw affectation, clever design meant to impress. Yet even skeptics agreed that the level of detail required sharp awareness of obscure holdings, half-forgotten parish borders, and long-buried marriage contracts. It wasn't clumsy imitation, but an unsettlingly familiar portrait of the medieval record. Part verifiable, part speculative. Take, for example, the alignments. Pilgrimage routes stretching through southern France trace near-perfect links to Merovingian-era strongholds, creating what appears less like accident and more like corridors of influence. When plotted on the Lobino map, these pathways carry a rhythm, tilting towards star positions or touching at shrines long associated with Magdalene devotion. To a cartographer it looks decorative. To a mind searching for continuity, it whispers of design, as if early dynasties planted shrines not only for the sacred, but also to chart memory across landscape. Some whisper that territory itself became archive, each monastery a waypoint in a hidden record. The dossiers go further. They tie marriages and property transfers to geographical pivots. A land grant between noble families appears positioned along an axis that matches the cycle of solstices. A marriage alliance sits astride a ley line later littered with Templar holdings. To call these alignments mere coincidence feels unsatisfying to some. Supporters suggest that this was preservation by architecture, by critical design. Even when paper records were burned or rewritten, the distribution of land itself would continue telling the story. A manor, a ruined tower, even a chapel stone could silently anchor remembrance across centuries. Perhaps the most suggestive element is the clustering of sacred images themselves. Magdalene shrines, statues of the Black Madonna, and Templar commanderies often share territories with suspicious neatness. One valley contains a cave shrine claimed to be Magdalene's, a blackened statue tucked into a Romanesque church, and the foundations of a Templar preceptory, all within a few miles. Plot that on a map and patterns emerge. Shapes that echo astronomical cycles. Critics call it coincidence. Others see deliberate code. Particularly striking is the tie between Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland and sites in the Languedoc. Rosslyn's carvings possess proportional ratios that echo churches scattered across southern France, where Cathedral memory and Magdalene lore flourished. Some geometric shapes appear again and again, intertwining vines measured not randomly but at repeating intervals, arches that inscribe equilateral triangles within their span. Supporters suggest these ratios allowed remembrance to travel invisibly, hidden within aesthetics. A pilgrim gazing upward might only see beauty. A builder, trained in the same school miles away, might see pattern echoing through hands and stone. Rosslyn becomes not an isolated curiosity but the northern edge of a continental system. Even the maps themselves feel coded. Compass roses are drawn not as decoration but with elongated points towards sites far from their obvious field. 8-pointed stars scatter across borders, sometimes aligning with ridgelines where Templar castles once stood. A clerk in the 1950s, copying these maps in quiet curiosity, described certain markers as cryptic, almost talismanic, though his personal notes were never published. To most eyes they are whimsical ornaments. To others, they appear as genealogical shorthand, silent testimony describing where blood and land converge. Looking closer, one notices that the maps also carry memorials no ordinary atlas would consider. Certain ruined monasteries are circled in faint ink, though by the 12th century they had long fallen from use. Others show recurring symbols, bees, vessels, stars, less like decoration than fragments of a hidden lexicon. Language without words. Some maps preserve these markings as though expecting a future reader who could recognise their meaning long after archives had been scattered. Stories in Rennes-le-Château feed similar intrigue. Within the dossier, symbols correspond to anomalies on the nearby ridgelines. One valley contains an 8-pointed star, to which a ruined Templar outpost seems tethered. Records from the area had long contained whispers of a hidden chamber, a tomb perhaps, or a concealed archive. Skeptics highlight how easily human eyes draw patterns across terrain that is, in reality, uneven and chance-shaped. Others maintain that pilgrims once traversing those valleys would have seen shrines lined up too directly to be disregarded. The debate, still unsettled, recasts the dossier less as fabrication and more as an invitation to interpretation. An interpretation may have been the point. By feeding verifiable figures into the mix, Godfrey de Bouillon, Bertrand de Blanchefort, noble bloodlines easy to trace, the creators of these maps built credibility. Then, by adding shadow names whose existence can never be fully confirmed, they crafted a record that wavers between factual and mythical. Geography calibrates this tension. You can dismiss a name. It is harder to dismiss land, stone, mountain. The dossier's maker knew this. A story mapped into landscape resists erasure. To uproot it would mean tearing down shrines, flattening abbeys, and shifting valleys themselves. What then if these maps were less about navigation and more about protection? Some accounts suggest that the networks of shrines formed a deliberate distribution system. Marriages locked into castle towers at specific nodes were not mere alliances but anchors in a memory grid. Land grants dosed across valleys preserved continuity. A shrine built in a crooked pass tethered Magdalene lore to the terrain. In this view, the dossier does not simply retell genealogy, it redesigns it spatially, treating territory as archive, its archives as sacred vault. Critics counter this projection, noting that selective interpretation can form patterns anywhere. Yet the endurance of these alignments, still visible centuries later, keeps the speculation alive. In this reading, the Grail itself shifts into geography, inheritance embedded in shrines, valleys and alignments. Where texts falter, terrain remembers. And nowhere does that memory feel more alive than in Provence, where caves and hilltop chapels weave Magdalene's presence directly into the land. The road twists upward through a dense green canopy, the air cooler with each step. Pine needles gather underfoot, softening the path as you move toward a limestone ridge. At its crest lies a cave known as La Sainte Baume, a chamber shaped by water and darkness. The stone walls are slick with centuries of moisture. Light seeping through the entrance scatters across patches of moss. Inside, the ceiling feels close, the atmosphere heavy. Charcoal marks and paint fragments still linger faintly, images smudged yet recognisable. A woman with flowing garments and a cascade of rust-coloured hair gazes from the rock. Pilgrims who entered centuries ago must have seen the same face glimmering in flicker of torchlight. Local veneration named her Mary Magdalene long before Rome allowed it. Stories say she stepped ashore not far from Marseille, carried across the Mediterranean after the crucifixion. Southern France in these tales became her refuge and her stage. In the villages, her presence was not tied to doctrine of penance, but to legacy. Locals built shrines in her name before the Vatican acknowledged her as saint. They painted her not broken down in guilt, but lifted as matriarch. This early devotion suggests memory that lived outside official channels. When speaking of her in caves and crypts, they describe not so much repentance as inheritance, the kind of presence that continues rather than concludes. The crypts at Saint-Maximin offer a different texture. Air is dry and cool below the church floor, the echo of footsteps following anyone who enters. Within stone chambers, relics attributed to Magdalene were guarded, yet what mattered more to devotion was the narrative tether. She had travelled here, lived here, perhaps died here. Her veneration had already woven deeply into regional rhythm. Farmers paused work during feast days, bakers left loaves as offerings, travellers carried home small stones from sites thought to have touched her. All of this centuries before Rome finally canonised her as saint. Tradition moved faster than decree. Folklore supports this. In the Basque country, within oral song cycles repeated around hearths, one phrase persisted about the woman who knew Christ's touch. This phrase avoided formal definition. It could be read as spiritual intimacy. It could also suggest physical closeness, perhaps familial bond. Oral tradition thrives on ambiguity, keeping meaning flexible so it can survive when scrutiny grows. Some whisper that such a phrase once gestured carefully at lineage. If Magdalene carried a child, this was how memory preserved it without risking the anger of bishops. The stories did not proclaim, they implied. People repeated them without claiming doctrine, yet passed forward the possibility. Artists contributed to this possibility through their paint and brush. Red hair repeats across depictions of Magdalene in the Provençal region. Sometimes it curls across shoulders, other times it flows loose down to her waist. Supporters suggest this consistency reflects memory of descent, preserved through inherited features. Critics counter that medieval convention often used red hair to mark unusual or passionate women, symbolic rather than genetic. Its recurrence may be more than convention. At minimum, it functioned as a recognisable cue. Shrines concentrate in corridors that read like anchors of memory, stone and cave doing what parchment could not. In Languedoc, Cathars built communities that insisted on dual sacred principles. Male and female both carried divine possibility. Body and spirit were equally relevant. This was dangerous doctrine for Rome. If lineage and flesh held sacred weight, then institutional control weakened. Cathar preaching thrived in the same valleys where Magdalene shrines dominated the hillsides. Their theology aligned naturally with memory of a female carrier of holy legacy. To the inquisitors, it looked heretical. To the locals, it may have simply echoed what they already believed, that sanctity passed through lines of inheritance as well as sacraments. Some whisper that this overlap is no accident. Cathar lands and Magdalene devotion concentrated in the same regions because one fed the other. People in the valleys passed down both ideas, reverence for the woman close to Christ, and a belief that sacred truth could survive outside bishops' chain of authority. When Rome crushed Catharism, it was both a theological and genealogical erasure. By removing sects that treated Magdalene as vessel of equal sacred authority, church forces tore at the scaffolding, protecting memory of possible bloodline. Yet the shrines remained. Geography preserved what crusade could not. A villager in the 13th century Provence might not have been thinking of dynastic charts while climbing to La Sainte-Baume. He or she might have carried bread, oil or fabric to leave in the cave as offering. Perhaps prayers spoke more of daily hunger and surviving war. Yet by honouring Magdalene not as sinner but as revered woman, they enacted memory that supported more than they understood. Tradition passes often through simple gestures. Lighting a candle in the dark recess of the cave was part devotion, part preservation. The story lived on in every whispered prayer, and that continuity may have been enough to keep the bloodline tale alive. The shrines then function like markers of a hidden path. What if these sites are not simply devotional, but genealogical? Supporters of the theory argue that each chapel functions like a waypoint pointing to continuity, scattered across southern France like stepping stones. Critics advise caution, seeing only strong regional devotion inflated into myth by modern speculation. But whether legend or literal, the intensity of Magdalene's presence in Provence stands out. Few saints, even those sanctioned, inspired such early, concentrated devotion across one landscape. In this light, the Albigensian purge reads as doctrinal suppression with genealogical consequences. Consider St. Maximin's crypts. They display skull fragments, bones, reliquaries linked to Magdalene. Authenticity is debated, but the effort to locate, claim and venerate them reveals a need for bodily nearness. Presence made tangible. Relics, whether authentic or created, testified to local insistence that Magdalene lived and died among them. That geographic insistence made her more real than distant doctrines. Step into the church above and hear the muted echo of footsteps among stone. Candles flicker, their flame bending in currents of air drawn from the crypt below. Modern pilgrims still arrive to touch the marble and kneel. While some come simply seeking intercession from a saint, others see continuity stretching backward, woven into centuries of repetition. This layering, pious devotion on one level, whispered bloodline claim beneath it, makes these sanctuaries more than religious stops. They stand as palimpsests of faith and possibility. What emerges here is a Magdalene of bearing rather than remorse. Regional images, phrases and shrines, sustaining a memory thicker than piety alone. Supporters suggest these elements compose a map of genealogical markers scattered across the countryside. Each sanctuary and chapel acts as a beacon, a subtle sign that the bloodline story had roots in actual practice. Critics counter that all of this can be explained by ordinary devotion, enhanced by later romantic imagination. Yet the persistence of the tradition, the density of shrines, and their overlap with Cathar lands make the possibility difficult to dismiss outright. Mary Magdalene becomes, in this frame, not primarily a disciple of the past, but matriarch of potential future. She's open not as symbol of regret, but as vessel of continuation. Southern France, with its caves and crypts, preserved that role in folklore centuries before the Vatican acknowledged her formally. The distinction matters because it suggests that memory of her lineage was safeguarded at the level of landscape and practice, not institution. From Provence, the trail doesn't end, it deepens. Archives, inscriptions, and landscapes still hold what sermons forgot. The next turn follows where the record strains, toward texts and ledgers, whose margins may yet name what shrines only imply. In a quiet reading room lit by the pale glow of computer screens, reels of microfilm sit forgotten, while new digital scans flicker across the glass. A worker runs gloved hands over a centuries-old manuscript, then lowers it under the lens of an imaging station. The hum of machinery replaces the scratch of a scholar's quill, where eyes once strained under candlelight. Algorithms now pass in quick succession, following patterns of handwriting, spacing, even the pressure of ink on page. For the first time, texts scattered in abbeys and archives thousands of miles apart can be cross-referenced instantly, a network of data that brings together scraps once thought impossible to connect. Behind this technological leap lies a paradox. The tools open gates to collections guarded for generations, yet the most important doors remain half-closed. Vatican holdings, noble genealogies, and administrative records of Templar commanderies enter digital repositories with breathtaking speed, but the catalogues often carry gaps, files listed without contents, entries marked as restricted. And then there are the whispered comments by custodians themselves, such as Father Gianni's remark about rooms mislabelled and keywords scrubbed. It suggests that digitisation does not erase control. Instead, the boundary shifts. Secrets now hide in metadata, an archive shaped less by locks than by what search terms never return. Still, even within the carefully filtered systems, remarkable discoveries surface. One of the most striking comes from handwriting analysis software, which identifies the peculiar curves and flourishes that mark a scribe's hand much as fingerprints identify a body. By comparing thousands of samples, modern systems expose forgeries once unquestioned and authenticate fragments long dismissed. A monk in 11th century Tours and another in a Burgundian monastery might be shown to be the same wandering copyist. Suddenly works assumed local gain new reach, and genealogical notes tucked in margins can be shown to have travelled with individuals rather than institutions. That detail matters, for inheritance trails are often preserved precisely in these marginal scribbles. Names, birth dates, cryptic symbols noted by hands not always faithful to official oversight. The potential extends beyond paleography. Where once relics were locked behind reliquaries, never to be disturbed, genetic genealogy now teases at the possibility of analysing them non-invasively. Fragments of hair, teeth, bone resting in reliquaries could yield mitochondrial signatures, mapping kinship across centuries. Yet such studies remain rare, blocked by permissions impossible to secure. Access is the most effective form of control. If relics cannot be touched, their evidence cannot destabilise doctrine. Supporters suggest that should DNA ever be drawn from objects tied to early saints, we might test theories of continuity between biblical figures and medieval dynasties. Critics counter such hope as fanciful. Without corroborating record chains, even a clear genetic profile could prove little. And so the debate circles around a body of evidence deliberately left untouched. Meanwhile, texts themselves reveal faint traces of what once lay hidden. Imaging technologies now expose palimpsests, manuscripts scraped and overwritten by later scribes who sought parchment more than preservation. Under infrared layers, ghost texts reappear, erased lines glowing faintly beneath the prayers copied above. Some of these shadows carry precisely the genealogical notes once suppressed, lineages of bishops, records of descent that hint at alternate successions. One medieval manuscript overwritten with hymns revealed beneath it a partial table mapping marriages of Merovingian nobility, a diagram likely dismissed as irrelevant in its age but today weighted with possibility. Not all such finds align with dramatic interpretations, but the very act of recovery reminds us that erasure was not absolute. Texts remember even when they were made to forget. As digitisation broadens, the monopoly of scholarship fractures. Amateur genealogists and independent researchers draw on open access portals to chase links between noble families and distant regions. A woman in Toulouse can compare notes with a researcher in Krakow, cross-matching names across centuries within hours. This democratization ensures vibrancy but also risk. Misreadings spread as quickly as genuine insight, and deliberate digital misdirection becomes possible. A forged entry seeded into an online database may ripple outward indistinguishable from the authentic, feeding conspiracy and confusion alike. In earlier centuries, forgery required parchment, pigment, and patient labour. Today it may take little more than altered metadata. Thus control repeats itself in a new layer. The very abundance of data can serve as fog, overwhelming clarity with noise. These cross-currents mean each revelation must be weighed carefully. The rediscovery of erased names does not prove bloodline continuity, but neither does their suppression erase the question. authenticity gains new shades. A marginal sketch dated by algorithm may reveal a consistent travelling scribe, but interpretation of his doodled sigils, whether playful ornament or coded genealogy, remains contested. Some suggest digitization may tempt guardians to release more than they intend. Once scanned, files can circulate. What leaves the Vatican servers may end up echoed in corners of the internet they never planned to reach. Others dismiss such concerns, arguing that true control lies not in withholding scans, but in shaping how databases are structured, funneling users toward official narratives. Against this background, the practice of digital paleography takes on almost mystical intensity. Picture the scholar hunched at a terminal, watching as infrared scans reveal undertext glimmering faint beneath the surface. The erased name of a forgotten noble surfaces letter by letter. A faint lineage tree stretches across folios as if awakened after centuries of burial. To the casual observer, these are technical marvels. To those invested in questions of descent, they are revelations. Supporters suggest that lineages tied to Magdalene traditions surface more often than random chance. Critics dismiss the correlation, noting the human tendency to attach pattern where none exists. Yet the possibility remains magnetizing, drawing both caution and fascination in equal measure. Even at the level of private libraries, digitization uncovers unexpected echoes. Collections in Portugal have yielded documents cross-matching names, otherwise thought unique to French monasteries. Croatian archives reveal seals of knights showing motifs identical to those in Norman holdings. Such links sketch networks of influence that once fell beyond the range of any scholar limited to one city. The circuits of movement, of scribes, nobles, and guardians, now appear interconnected, a web spanning the breadth of medieval Europe. Viewed through this widened lens, guardianship of bloodline memory seems less isolated. A collective effort spanning orders and families, each preserving fragments that alone may appear trivial but together suggest coherence. Yet every advance comes with reminder of control. Special collections often release digitized versions only as images, stripping metadata to cloak origin. Others provide high resolution for decorative initials but blur marginal notes that might contain puzzling references. Such selective digitization shapes not only what is accessible, but what scholars even know to ask. Absence is crafted as carefully as presence. The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. Secrecy adapts as fast as discovery. And so the stage feels double. At one level, we see unprecedented access. From a desk at home, you can pull folios once kept under locks centuries deep in abbey vaults. At another, the most consequential material remains shielded by subtler methods. The classification of metadata, the redaction of terms, the silent disappearance of inconvenient indexing. The appearance of openness can itself be its own shroud. Each discovery must therefore be understood in dual light, as revelation and as reminder of what still lies out of reach. The same technology that grants access may be used to veil, with algorithms tuned not to reveal but to smooth, to erase, to control. Some whisper that the true battleground has shifted from physical archives to digital architecture. Others counter that the hunt itself, no matter its filters, ensures that fragments will continue to slip beyond guardianship. Secrets do not stay buried forever. With every new release of manuscripts, every spectral text uncovered through imaging, the possibility of genealogical confirmation grows, yet the shadow of curated data remains. A single suppressed relic, a missing metadata tag, can skew interpretation as profoundly as the closed doors of medieval scriptoria ever did. The contest between revelation and concealment continues, only translated into circuitry, which raises the question, if fragments of lineage can be traced even now, who carries that inheritance in the present? To answer, we must turn from archives to bodies, from digitized memory to living heirs. toward the possible inheritors of a bloodline said to flow from Christ himself. Night settles over the Languedoc, shadows thickening across fields once crossed by crusaders. In one farmhouse, the family gathers around a table where a tattered cloth is laid out only on feast days. Its embroidery shows a faded knotwork design no one can name, part cross, part vine, a pattern older than memory. Each generation is told it must never be thrown away. No one explains why in full, only that it carries a blessing older than the church calendar itself. These small inheritances, folded into ordinary households, feel like fragments of memory disguised as custom. Across villages, it isn't relics or shrines that hint at continuity, but habits so ordinary they escape notice. Families who bury tokens beneath thresholds, lineages that repeat unusual baptismal names across centuries, households that light candles at wayside shrines no longer marked on parish maps. These gestures rarely appear in records, yet they echo practices tied to covenant and remembrance. To the outside eye, they are quaint traditions. To insiders, they may be coded acts of preservation, keeping alive what could not be written. The possibility unsettles because it shifts the bloodline story from medieval vaults into modern flesh. If heirs survive through such quiet transmission, they might no longer stand in castles or abbeys, but in towns, professions, and families indistinguishable from anyone else. Their heritage would live less in visible grandeur and more in the rhythms of daily life. Rituals at harvest, marriages guided by unwritten rules, heirlooms kept with superstitious caution. In this sense, descent would not need to be declared. It would breathe inside habits repeated without explanation. Outside France, echoes appear as well. In northern Spain, Basque singers still carry fragments of names no longer found in parish records, threading them into seasonal ballads. In parts of Italy, confraternities once barred women, except for one group that traced its authority to a lady from the East, a title left deliberately vague. Such fragments may mean little individually, yet together they suggest that memory of unusual descent travelled more widely than Provence alone. The most striking element is how myth functions for those who inherit it. For some families, the suggestion of special lineage becomes a source of pride, an explanation for resilience in hardship, a thread that binds their story into something larger than survival. For others, it is a burden. Daughters told to guard heirlooms more tightly than sons, or households warned never to sell a piece of land with a promise on it, live under expectations they never chose. In that sense, the bloodline myth operates not only as empowerment but as restraint, shaping lives in quiet, invisible ways. Consider the paradox. If true heirs exist, they may be protected precisely by their obscurity. A farmer tilling rocky soil may carry as much legacy as a prince, but remain shielded by anonymity. Discovery would end that protection, turning identity into spectacle. History shows that heirs revealed too openly often become pawns in struggles they cannot control. For some, secrecy may not only preserve the myth, it may preserve survival. And yet the allure of living heirs remains magnetic because it collapses centuries into the present moment. The Grail ceases to be a chalice hidden in a crypt or a code carved into cathedrals. It becomes something you might encounter at a market stall, or in a neighbour's surname, or in the unspoken customs of a family whose gestures carry more weight than they admit. The possibility makes the story harder to dismiss, because it suggests the legend might be standing quietly beside us. What matters, perhaps, is not whether every claim is true, but that the idea refuses to dissolve. The persistence of these whispers, through feast day cloths, buried tokens, forgotten songs, shows how memory adapts, camouflages, and hides in plain sight. Even if the heirs remain unknown, the practices that surround them suggest lineage survives best when hidden in ordinary lives too quiet to invite suspicion. You sit in a quiet room at night and imagine the weight of a single document, a scrap of parchment tucked into a monastery ledger or sealed in a cathedral vault, confirming a name that should not exist. a genealogical trace that would move the axis of history. Such a fragment, if verified, would press against every assumption the West has carried about authority, legitimacy and faith for nearly 2,000 years. That is why the question is more than academic. It cuts to the root. At the centre lies the principle of apostolic succession. For the Catholic Church, power is not passed down through biology but through spiritual appointment. Bishops are ordained by bishops, each link reaching back toward the apostles, and through them to Christ. The line is symbolic rather than genetic, a chain of consecrated hands stretching across centuries. Papal authority rests entirely on this structure. To imagine that Christ left a physical bloodline is to inject an alternate claim that obeys flesh rather than sacrament. Suddenly legitimacy no longer resides only in the ritual of ordination, but in bones and DNA. That possibility does not weaken the structure, it empties it. The weight of monarchy would also shift. Through medieval Europe, royal dynasties justified rule as conferred by God. They spoke of divine right, a notion that confirmed crowns fell not by might alone but by celestial blessing. Yet if a Christ bloodline existed, then even the most ancient dynasties would grow pale beside it. Lineages traced through Charlemagne or William the Conqueror lack force when measured against a genealogy that claims the Nazarene himself. Nobles who had aligned their right to rule with the favour of the papacy would find themselves displaced. The entire edifice of hereditary monarchy would buckle. Some whisper this was precisely why such traditions had to be suppressed from the start. Think for a moment about the strange ripple outward. If sacramental power can be bypassed by genetic inheritance, then the sacraments themselves, baptism, ordination, even Eucharist, might seem secondary. Faith becomes grounded not only in belief, but in body. That would erase one of the strongest bonds holding Christians to institutional practice. Millions who attended Mass not just for worship, but on trust that this was the unique channel of divine grace, would suddenly see the possibility of alternative authority in living heirs. The monopoly collapses. It is the difference between a world where salvation is mediated by church decree and a world where a family line becomes sacred by default. Modern political frameworks would not escape unscathed. Imagine democracies that fought to end aristocratic privilege suddenly faced with proof of an ancient holy inheritance. Would nations recoil from the idea or bend under the weight of its mythic pull? Movements that struggled to sever blood from power, revolutions, republics, constitutional experiments, might find themselves undermined by fascination with sacred dissent. Even parliaments and elected offices could be pressured to yield symbolic weight to those carrying an apostolic gene. Some critics argue that this alone makes the topic dangerous, for it threatens to conjure aristocratic frameworks precisely at a moment when global politics are still struggling with equality. The risks are not only institutional, they are human. Competing claims to sacred DNA could fragment communities. If one branch of a family held recognition as heirs, rival branches might counter with their own genealogical proofs. This could divide nations along lines of descent, forcing questions of authenticity that no one can truly settle. The violence such conflicts would generate is not hypothetical. History is already littered with wars of succession, where disputed bloodlines tore empires apart. Introduce Christ as ancestor, and the intensity sharpens. The wars would no longer be about secular crowns, but about who carries the flesh of divinity itself. An even darker possibility lingers. Sacred DNA could be weaponized in the service of hierarchy. The 20th century saw how pseudo-scientific genetics were twisted into tools of exclusion. Add religion, and the effect multiplies. Some would argue that only those descended from Christ hold true authority, reshaping politics into a theology of supremacy. Others could exploit the myth to justify new forms of caste or segregation, backed falsely by genetic proofs. What was once allegory would become the most potent form of tribalism, ancestry masquerading as destiny. Such outcomes are why many historians prefer to emphasise symbolic readings of the Grail rather than genetic ones. Too much risk radiates from even entertaining its literal form, and yet the other side of possibility should not be ignored. If Christ left children, it rewrites incarnation in an entirely new language. No longer does divinity hover as something apart from mortal life. It would mean the sacred chose full immersion, not only entering flesh but continuing through ordinary generations. This would not reduce Jesus' role, instead it grounds him more deeply in humanity. Suddenly the divine is not remote but interwoven, felt in the daily continuity of birth, marriage, and kinship. The split between holy and human grows thinner. Some whisper this would energize Christianity rather than weaken it, reminding believers that the sacred can inhabit ordinary bloodlines. It would not destroy faith but reorient it. The paradox is striking. Proof of a Christ lineage could simultaneously fracture institutions and renew spirituality. The church might lose monopoly, but individuals might gain an embodied understanding of God's nearness. Pilgrims might not seek relics in glass jars but hope to glimpse families bearing the legacy. Critics counter that such a faith quickly becomes idolatry of genealogy. Yet the appeal endures. It touches a longing for immediacy. The idea that divine story continues not as something finished long ago, but as something breathing just beyond recognition. Consider the way genealogical searches already occupy millions today. People who once felt detached from history now spend evenings sifting online databases, piecing together ancestors lost to time. Imagine such tools uncovering even the faintest shred of evidence connecting Christ to a surviving line. The hunger for belonging would meet the grandest origin story possible. Families could reinvent identities overnight. Entire nations could claim heritage, using faint threads of descent to reposition their role in history. The flood of reinterpretation would overwhelm scholarship. Genealogies, once niche hobbies, would become weapons of political and spiritual battle. This is why historians often prefer curated forgetting. Not because the notion is inherently unbelievable, but because the repercussions lean toward chaos. A single strand, no thicker than a strand of hair, could force both church and state into an impossible re-evaluation. Sacraments would bend against genetics. Thrones would shudder beneath rival contracts. Republics, long cautious of returning to dynastic privilege, would flinch at sacred descent rising in cultural imagination. One name discovered in a vault could trigger more upheaval than revolutions armed with cannons. Think of it as a search for the sacred itself. Where does divinity flow? From institutions, sacraments, councils, or from veins and blood? If Christ left no lineage, then the Church holds definitive authority. If he did leave heirs, then every cathedral stone rests on an unstable foundation. This tension, more than any particular artifact, is why the Grail story persists. It is not about cups of gold or secret orders. It is about a question institutions cannot afford to answer definitively. To confirm or deny too strongly would endanger the ground they stand upon. The mystery endures not because evidence is abundant, but because the consequences of either outcome are profound. A confirmed genealogy demands reordering of both theology and politics. A disproven genealogy demands acknowledgement, and even that would admit the possibility it was taken seriously. Secrets survive because sometimes the weight of truth would collapse existing structures. And so the ambiguity is preserved, half in whispers, half in shadows. You imagine again that single piece of parchment, a name, a line, a carefully inked parentage that connects a long-forgotten Merovingian heir to a man who once walked the dusty streets of Galilee. Whether such a document exists or not almost becomes secondary. The stakes of its existence shape the story more than the artifact itself. It explains why archives remain locked, why chronicles were reworded, why shrines cluster in places unsanctioned by Rome. It explains centuries of silence, because that silence carries more force than revelation ever could. And so the trail circles back to its starting point. After centuries of rumour, symbol and suppression, what remains is not resolution but reflection. The quest was never purely about relics buried in stone or guardianship by knights. It was about the question itself, suspended between faith and flesh. Even if proof never surfaces, the possibility continues to haunt imagination. That may be the truest power of the Grail bloodline mystery. It makes us ask what would change if blood mattered as much as belief. And in that asking, faith and identity look different, regardless of what rests in sealed vaults. Because sometimes the greatest tremor comes not from the answer, but from the question you dare to keep open. And here, in the stillness, that question waits. Half history, half inheritance, a possibility no archive has yet closed. The Grail shows itself less as an object than as a thread running through time, stitched from gospel gaps to hidden archives and digital scans. It is memory that refuses to settle, pulsing quietly beneath centuries of curated forgetting. Whether a bloodline exists in flesh or survives only as metaphor, the pursuit itself reflects our questions about where authority truly lies and what inheritance means. Some view it as myth, others treat it as map. But both readings meet in the same twilight space. Keep your mind open, your skepticism close. Truth and tale do not separate easily.